Hey everyone, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
We have John on.
I'm here.
John. There you are. Okay. Zoom's kind of weird. It moves the screens around, so hopefully it keeps you in the same spot.
Cool.
Cool. Hey John, so just confirming, your talk is called A Guide to Components for Product Managers, right?
Correct.
Awesome. We're gonna get started in about 5 minutes here. Just want to remind everyone, please leave your video on, but your audio muted. Please remember to use the YouTube live chat. I'll provide instructions once we get started for questions, and just prefix your questions with uppercase MM so that I know you are a mentor, and I will prioritize your questions. John, please make sure you've got no other windows open, that you've got, the do not disturb going. And everyone, don't use the Zoom meeting chat to communicate. You could, I guess, message me directly if there's some sort of issue, but hopefully there is none. Cool, we'll get started in a minute here. John, a couple more reminders for you.
Sure.
The audio is repeating in Zoom. Oh. Is that happening for everyone or just Syed? No. Maybe Syed, maybe try rejoining. Yeah. That happens sometimes. Maybe you have the YouTube going too or something. I don't know. John, also, just like power through any technical problems, just keep going. I have your slide deck, I believe. I can load up if necessary. I'll interrupt you at convenient points with any questions, so just look out for that. If I interrupt you, just obviously stop. Well, actually, you don't need to necessarily stop sharing, because we'll be able to see your video and your presentation at all times. Everyone should ask questions during the talk. John, don't feel the need to ask if we can hear you or not. I'll shoot you an email if we can't hear you, but assume that it's all going well and that we can hear you. Cool.
Sorry, one question there. When you say you're going to fire questions, is that through the chat or visual or verbally?
I will read through the chat, but I'll verbalize them. So I'll cut you off like in between slides if there's a question.
I don't need to like monitor anything kind of.
No. Yeah, just listen out for me. I'll
ever be nice to me, because I'm the first one. So
well, this is our first time doing Zoom for this, so we'll take it slow.
No problem then.
It'll be this is the format for Zoom is great though, so I'm really excited to do it this way.
Excellent. Okay.
Cool. We'll get started in about 2.5 minutes. So we are going to spotlight me to start. So everyone give me a quick moment or two to be able to toggle the videos before everyone talks so that it's spotlighting the appropriate person. right, last quick reminder to please keep your video on, but yourself muted until called on. Just remember to unmute. I will call on everyone for introductions when we get started, and then keep yourself on mute while John does the presentation. All right, here we go. Hey everyone, it's Sunday, August 11th, 2019, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. We're joined by one of our mentors, John Masterson. He will be leading a talk on a guide to components for product managers. I'm going to briefly explain the format before we get started. So the Product Mentor program has been going on for several years. It matches product leaders with product managers and folks who aspire to be product managers, who aspire to get better at product management. It's a mentorship program. As part of the program, each of the product mentors does a talk, a webcast at a different Sunday throughout the program. We have several talks today, beginning with John's. We're joined today by all the mentors and mentees in the program are live on the webcast, as well as folks from across the world watching on YouTube. I'm going to switch to gallery view if everyone could just wave. Awesome. And we're going to go around the room and do introductions. So let's begin with Alex.
Hey guys, I'm Alex. Yeah, sorry about my webcam. That seems to be working. As you can see, it should be. I have my little video icon, but yeah, it's not detecting it. So I'll try and fix that over the course of the call. But yeah, I'm Alex. I'm one of the mentees on the program. I'm product manager in London for a company called LexisNexis. So yeah, I've been doing it a couple of years now. But yeah, really thankful to be on this course, getting lots of good support from my mentor. So yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome, thanks. And Brian.
Hey everybody, I'm Brian Postelnick. I'm a product mentor in the program. Been a product manager for 6 years. I'm a product manager currently at Angie's List, based in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Great, and Carlos.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. So, my name is Carlos Ruiz. I'm calling from Spain. I work for a startup called Mr. Yev. We mainly operate in around 14 countries in South America, providing on-demand laundry and dry cleaning services. My mentor is Nis. It's a great pleasure to join to this session and to meet all of you.
Awesome. And Daniel.
Yeah, hey, my name is Dan Derponsingi. I am a product manager at a company called Moto Insight, based in Toronto. Hi, everyone.
Awesome. You're a mentor or mentee, you said?
I am a mentee.
Awesome. And John.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm John Masterson, and I am a mentor. You're about to hear quite a lot more about me, but I am currently the Chief Product Officer at a startup in London called ImproveWell.
Awesome. And Nicola.
Hey, I'm Nicola. I'm based in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and I'm product manager in 2021 AI.
Awesome. You're a mentor or mentee?
I'm mentee.
Awesome. Yeah, if everyone could say their name, location, role, and mentor and mentee. Let's move over to Syed.
Hi, everyone. Mine is going to be a bit longer. I'm a mentee, and my mentor is present, Brian. I have learned a lot from him. And I'm grateful to this group because I just got hired by Verizon, and he's also a member of the product group. So I met him through the product group.
Awesome.
And I'm going to be working as a senior product owner.
That's awesome. Congrats.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Vivek.
Hi, hi everyone. This is Vivek. I'm based out of Bangalore, India. I'm part of the product team at Razorpay, the payments company. I'm a mentee. John is my mentor.
Awesome. And let's move on to Yogesh. You're muted, Yogesh.
Hi, hi everyone. I'm Yogesh, and I'm senior product manager at the company called Omnicom Health Group, and I'm a mentor. And my mentee is present here today. His name is Nicola.
Awesome. And let's move over to Candice. Candice, do you have a microphone going? I just see video, although not really. Okay, we've got video. You need a microphone. There you go. You've got microphone. Candice, can you hear us? Okay, we'll try for the next video. Come over to me. So everyone, just as a reminder, please post your questions to the Q&A section at the productmentor.com/live. As the questions come in, I will jump in at convenient times, interrupt John, and ask that question live. Just so you know, I am Nis Frome. I'm one of the mentor leads for the program. I've been participating in the Product Mentor for about 4 years now, and I am the moderator for today's live stream. With that being said, John, let me switch the camera over to you and then take it away.
Okay, great. Right, spare me 1 second. Okay, so yeah, without further ado, I'm going to jump into my presentation. So for me, the presentation that I have chosen is what I'm calling a guide to components for product managers, or what I wish I knew when I was younger. And really what I'm hoping to do is, this topic is quite personal to me. It really follows, kind of follows a journey that I've actually gone through, you know, from when I've been learning about really components and obviously making my way through in product management. So I think what I'd like to do is, like all good journeys, is start at the start. So the reason I kind of want to give a bit of context as to my background is because one of the things I'd like to talk about in this slot is also the frequently asked question of really how technical should a product manager be. And really, a lot of what I'm talking about today is kind of the intersection of development and product management. So for me, I began my I was writing a bio recently for our company, and I was sort of slightly shocked to realize that it was 20 years ago that I began kind of my tech journey. And at the age of 18, aging myself there, I joined a database development company. And it was really here that I was lucky enough to get the foundations of my knowledge. So it really informed my thinking and potentially, you know, really still shapes how I look at systems today. So I worked in this small company here. I'm from Ireland, as you may tell from my accent. I worked in this small company as I made my way through university. I actually studied economics. So again, not a technical degree. I don't have a computer science background, but sort of kept working part-time within this database development company. I then moved out of that and moved into, again, really completely out of the field of software, but into a large PLC here in Ireland, where I was involved in a lot of data analysis and building some systems in-house, which I designed myself, but really was the end user as well at the same time. My journey continued, where finally I found myself in Sydney, and it was there that I got back into software and originally again doing database development. Before, as the company was moving all their products into web, Ruby on Rails based technology, I moved out of that and then started into product management. So I guess I kind of feel like I am somewhat technical, and again, it hugely depends on your perspective. But I then made the move back to London, or at least back to this side of the world, in London about 3 years ago, and started into joined a startup in London called AG Grid, which, very pertinent to this talk, sells JavaScript data grids. So I landed quickly in the world of components. I'm currently the chief product officer at a company called ImproveWell, and we're have to get my plug-in for my product. A workforce engagement platform here for healthcare. But really what's been very interesting is that a lot of the things I'm about to talk to, I get a chance to try and implement those within my current role. So really just going to jump back to, the reason why have I chosen this topic? So the seeds of this topic really were planted when I first started that role with AG Grid. I simply didn't know that these things existed. I'm still slightly embarrassed to say that today. So really my eyes were really opened. So AG Grid is a JavaScript data grid. So what it offers is a huge amount of functionality out of the box into, so when you're, delivering your products for the front end. As I say, I'm going to, drop the name of a couple of products throughout this. It's very much not, I'm not recommending any one or the other. I mean, I really would say to you, go and, educate yourself and find out about these things. But I do have a very good relationship with the guys still at AG Grid, and I do think it's a great product, and I want to use myself now. So I will refer to it throughout the production. So really, what struck me straight away was, as I sat and I worked with the CEO of this company, was we had our initial conversation, was how much I could have used this product. So again, in my role in Sydney, it was basically, I was responsible for delivering with a couple of systems that I was responsible for, but one of which was essentially a recruitment system, which I'm sure you can imagine had lots of lists of job seekers, lots of lists of jobs and skills and lists everywhere, basically, with places where I'd want to do filtering, places I'd want to do searching, all of those types of things. So I only tended to find out about components when they didn't work or when they couldn't do what I needed them to do. So again, I'd often be faced with, the piece of work would go into the backlog, and I would hear back from my development team that, this couldn't be done without a major refactor. Because the plugin that we were using didn't support pagination, or didn't. I remember one specifically where we had thousands of rows of data, and I wanted to be able to, find everyone in that list that had the name John, for example. For some reason, all my searches always involved John. But again, for some technical reasons, this couldn't happen. So again, as I kind of work through these things, I mean, there's another example of where, where using data tables this time, it wouldn't remember exactly what, your previous search, the user had to redo their searches. So again, in all of these scenarios, these are not major problems. We overcame them all. We were managed to do, we did a bit of refactoring, maybe lost a few days, a week, whatever it may have been. But in each of these cases, I think I ended up with, I wasn't entirely happy with the results that we finished up with. So as I continued, and as I sat there in AG Grid, and this realization came to me that essentially I'd been using inferior solutions in the past, but also the kind of greater thing was, to paraphrase the great Donald Rumsfeld, I had unknown unknowns. So what I was more shocked at was that I didn't actually know about these things that were out there. So really, if you're going to take away one thing from my talk today, it's just be aware that these things exist. And yeah, I didn't know what to Google. So now, and I in my role at AG Grid, I spent a lot of time optimizing SEO for JavaScript data grids. So I know what to Google now. But again, casting myself back, and there may be people watching this, watching this now, is I didn't know what to look for. So with that in mind, that's why when I was asked for a topic, I decided, what, I'm going to try and share. I'm going to share the message of this because I think it's quite an important one. So then what do I mean by components? So because again, this isn't just really, this talk isn't just about components. It's actually using components as a bit of an allegory for for a way of thinking that I'm hopefully going to explain a little bit further. So for me, components are pre-built packages of functionality. And of course, everyone here will look, we're looking at this, will know this is of course widely used. Every repo that you're going to look at is going to have huge numbers of packages. Your development team will pick out lots of, it's rare that they're really reinventing the wheel, although obviously sometimes they are. So every project has multiple packages, as I say. The one that always jumps to mind and probably is the easiest to kind of visualize is charts or graphs. So we all sort of know about charts and graphs. Maps is another one. Data grids, as I've spoken about. Now, obviously, in this case, it would be entirely feasible for you to go and build your own graphs, design a nice graphical interface. You could design all of the legends. You could do all the data labels, and there probably are development teams out there that would love to do that. But what I would say is, that really isn't a credible option in this case. So what I'm trying to say here today is that there's other places where this is the case as well. So really, for me, it's about picking your battles, really. There are going to be some cases where components you don't need to get involved in the selection of components or packages, because that's left up to your development team. But there are going to be cases where you need to get, as a product manager, I think you do need to get involved. And really, this is what I'm saying about components, is it also represents a way of thinking. So by that, I mean, it's how you, what ultimately is the end functionality that it's delivering for your users. During this talk, I'm really going to focus on more of the UI style components. But as I say, really what I want to think is that it's really the goal of this and of the way that I would try to approach products is trying to find solutions, pre-built solutions to the problems that you have already. So a classic question, really, I think that sort of naturally arises from this is where does the responsibility lie for choosing these? And I think, as I pointed out over my career, I've worked in a variety of different types of organizations. I've been fortunate enough to work in organizations where the product and development teams are incredibly tightly coupled. There's a great knowledge amongst the development team of really a deep understanding of their end user. And I've worked with teams and where that connection is not quite as strong. And really the role of the product manager there is really to represent that the end user and there's final piece of functionality at the table. So what was really interesting to me so again, my role at AG Grid encompassed a lot of on the sales side as well, sales and marketing roles. And what was very interesting to me in there was that I really rarely heard from product managers. It was usually developers that I was hearing from. So I mean, based on that sort of empirical evidence, it's suggesting to me that a lot of these times, the responsibility for these decisions is landing with development. And as I say, in some cases that's great. Some cases that works really well. But go back to the example that I gave you of my time before. That I needed to be there. I needed to be at the table to make those decisions and make those voices heard around what are the things, the features that need to be sort of delivered at the end. So I would say to you is in your own organization, where are you in this process? As a product person, are you relying on your development team to make all of these decisions for you? Are you providing them with some guidance around what the thing needs to do, how it needs to look? Again, I think I say this to and Vivek will back me up in what I say during all of my mentoring sessions is everything that I know today comes from when I've done it wrong. So I have been the person who didn't speak enough with my development team to make these concerns come through in sort of the selection of these pieces. You need to be the one at the table representing your customer. You need to be the one at the table representing that, yes, they can make the legend of the chart a little bit bigger, or they can the color points on a data grid, or sorry, on a chart can be different colors, or that level of granularity needs to be, I think it has to come from the product manager. So
hey John, we've got a question here.
Sure.
I'm gonna stop your sharing for 1 second here. I've got a question from Alex actually about your background. You've talked a lot about your background throughout this talk and how it's kind of informed your approach today. So I'm gonna call on Alex here, who has a question about that posted in the channel. Alex.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, cheers. Yeah, great talk, John. Recognize you said you came from like an economics background and business background, and then you kind of learned your trade from that. Similar here, actually. I was a business background and then did a marketing role and kind of learned product and tech on the job. Still probably not at the level I want to be now, but that's kind of my background too. Just wondering, from your point of view, do you see that as kind of a negative or a positive, and how you kind of cope with that?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I'm going to say I think it's a positive, and I actually do think it is positive, because I mean, people ask me, the question is, how technical am I? I can sit and read code. I can't write it. It's almost like a language. I can understand Spanish, but I can't speak it. So I'm not adept enough to write code. But I think because I've built systems for myself, say, and I think I mentioned that role, I've been very much I'm very much focused on what is the end result of what it can do. So ultimately, I don't mind what framework we use. I don't mind what component we use. I don't mind, I'm not. But what I do care is that I can change the color of a chart because it has to meet sort of accessibility standards, or I can make these incremental. I don't like the way that a drop down works, and that I have to I can't autocomplete by typing. So really, I'd nearly be inclined to say, for a product manager role, is that a little bit of technical know-how is good, but really for me the real focus is on what's the product going to do. And when I come to the next few slides, actually, Alex, I'll kind of address a bit more my philosophy on what's a useful way of approaching a system.
Perfect. Good answer. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, John. If you don't mind sharing the slides again. Thanks.
Sure. I'm glad you had a question. So clearly people are listening. That's a good start. Okay, great. So yes, I think, as I said, where does the responsibility for this lie? And again, like I say, I'm really open about the fact that I didn't do a good job of this in the past, and ultimately, I sort of, I rely on that. I bore the consequence of that by having these large refactors and having these pieces of functionality, not delivered for my users. So, so again, the question is, open question. This one is where is product in all of this? Another interesting thing as well is that, I think what is, you look at the different sort of almost personality types or skill sets of the different functions in an organization, and going back to my time selling these components, was very often the competitor for our products. I say competitor. Very often the alternative to people buying our product was actually they wanted to build it in-house themselves. So you very often, again, this is my experience, it won't be everyone's experience, but very often the experience will be that development teams want to take on these things and they want to build them in-house themselves. And I think, you need to be that person representing, saying, look, no, that's not giving value to the customer. Ultimately you're there to give value to the customer. And I think, as I see it, you're the voice that says, no, look, surely someone has done this before. Why can't we just build on what's done before? So you may face pushback from this, but I mean, there's a natural tension that occurs between product and development. I mean, that's every organization has them. I think it's healthy, and I think you kind of need to be the checks and balances for one another. So what I'd say is, think about think about it and assess what are the skill sets that exist in your organization. You know, are you in that fortunate position where there's a great connection between tech, you know, I say tech, say development and product, and they really clearly understand? Or are you more to the other side where really you're representing that and tech are very focused on, again, you know, maybe technically excellent in terms of implementing, but you need to provide them with more of that vision around, you know, what it needs to do. So I think, as I say, assess where you are in these things, and then find a blend that works for you. I mean, I think ultimately, and again, it's something that always jumps out in these things. And again, I've been in teams that do it well and teams that don't do it well. You have to develop that connection and that relationship between product and development anyway. You know, that's key to the success of any company, I suppose, is getting good development out there, is working on that relationship. So this is an opportunity perhaps to do that. You know, you need to give development the scope to choose the bits that they want. But equally, you need to just be clear as to what you need this thing to do, and try and think into the future a little bit of, you know, what do you think it's going to need to do in the next whatever number of iterations. Right. So this neatly brings me on to a sort of, I guess in a way, what I would call my philosophy for product management, which is a bit of an extension of my initial title, but really it's this idea of really component-based thinking. So for me, component-based thinking is it's about being able to look at your system and look at any prospective new system that you have, and break it down into different components. Now, in some of those cases, they may be actual components. So it might be, you know, it has 10 data grids, 5 charts, whatever else it might be, a map, so again, I've and many of these pieces might be technical. So again, I'm not getting into what frameworks you're using. I'm not getting into what's the backend technology, what's the hosting, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, now you know those things are there, but that's not your purview. That's obviously, that lives with your development team. But I do think you're almost thinking about it in terms of bits of functionality. So really to kind of illustrate this, I'd like to point to, say, again, we're building a real estate site. So for me, and again, at a very simplistic level, I might think, okay, right, this needs a login. So it needs to login. Then I'm going to have a landing page with a search element. Then I'm going to have a listing view. Again, one of my old friends, data grids. I'm going to have a map view because I want to see where the properties are. And then I'm going to have web forms with various fields. So sort of, I guess, almost ideologically, I'm thinking, okay, it's 20, 25 pieces almost, and then, or blocks. So again, you're trying to break it down into these blocks, and then you're trying to look at it and say, okay, well, let's try and make as many of these blocks be as kind of the same size as they can be. And then this is where I think you start saying, okay, right, well, I've got 25 blocks in my system. Which of those is really the special piece for me? So I'm going to get my shopping list of all the things I need. So I need, in this case, a data grid. I need some form of a login component. Again, it's a classic one that I think often gets rebuilt every time. It always seems to be done at the start of a project, is, you know, you spend the first 3 months logging in. I think what I'd always say to that is that none of your users are ever going to call you up and say, it's so unbelievable the way I was able to log in today. Really, that was a really good part of your system. So that's just taken for granted. So therefore, it should be applied, you know, an appropriate amount of effort should be applied to that. So you get your shopping list and you try to think through. And again, you know, it comes with experience, and it comes with really, you know, educating yourself. Is, right, what are the different things that can be on my shopping list? So it could be things like, I think, as I mentioned, right, you need a map. So you might need, you think about date pickers. Again, you know, date pickers all behave differently in different browsers, which can deliver a bit of a weird experience. So maybe you need to think about something there. In terms of when you're looking at fields, the way that people interact with those fields around, choosing, multi-select drop downs, single select, do they need to be able to easily delete them? All these types of things. Again, I believe these are things that you should kind of address once, and then they just kind of go into they just become part of the blocks that you use to build your software. So once you've engaged or you've prepared your shopping list, it's then a case of right now go and engage with your technical team and say, right, these are the components as I see it, and let's go through them in some detail. So again, what I would really be saying here as well is like what you're trying to do here is you're trying to solve for spending as much time as you can on the special bit of your system. So again, coming back to the example of the real estate system, might be that I've got a unique algorithm in there, or I've got some special way of displaying things on a map that hasn't been done before, whatever it might be. How much of your time are you going to spend on that versus how much of your time are you going to spend on these other components? So really, that's where I'm trying to come to with this, as I call it, component-based thinking, is trying to really maximize the amount of time that you can spend on the things that are unique and are going to actually make your product stand out and be different.
Hey, John, we've got a couple more questions here.
Sure.
I'm going to stop your sharing again here. I think you might have just answered one, but Syed, you had a question about a kind of accountability and roles. Was that question answered, or do you
I think I might not have understood it completely, but the question for John is that when you are, I think you addressed it, but when you are considering adapting a new tool or technology, is it you driving that force, or are you letting the development team come up with the ideas and the products that they are to be used?
It's a good question. It's one that I think I would say I probably refer to my experience, and I'd say I've done both. And I think you have a problem if you're forcing people to do things, first of all. So I mean, I think this kind of gets into sort of culture a little bit. So it's where possible, this does need to be done by consensus. In my current role, I would be making the final call, I guess, on the pieces. However, really it's about trying to have a communication whereby you can just get forward, right? You can choose the solution so long as it does these things.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So if you are making that final decision, what factors would you consider in making the decision?
Good question. I mean, cost is one. I mean, these things aren't free. In some cases they are free, but cost is one. I haven't really covered into I'm about to touch on sort of a build versus buy scenario, but the one thing I would sort of say is I think, again, sort of experience tells me that effort is always greatly underestimated. And when you get into trying to again, speaking from the example of, and I really hope I'm not coming across as someone who sort of, is biased by my experience, but, I did have examples of when I was, providing these components was we would have teams come and tell us, oh, well, my team has said we could build that in 2 months, in 3 months. And I'd be like, yeah, it took us 2 years of doing nothing else than, so I think it's almost a way of trying to just have that message in your head again of like, I think selecting components is a less risky approach for some, because I think the people who are you underestimate the amount of time and effort that's gone into building these things. So that I would almost try and instill a bias in myself to select them if possible, and really ask yourself, why would you not do it, rather than why would I do it? Again, that's because the important part of your system is the bit that no one else is doing. That would be my sort of philosophy on it.
We actually have one more question. I'm cognizant here of time, but if we could address this somewhat quickly.
Okay.
Viva, you had a question as well.
Yeah. So hey John, Vivek here. So I had a question around the components bit, right? I think you have answered a bit in terms of it spoke about shopping list, right? I'm thinking of that as components. But sometimes, even those as a PM, I'm worried about say scalability, right? And should I get into then discussions with development team in terms of what should be the microservices architecture? Or there's something that which is not visible to the end user, but something which impacts in terms of performance, right? The TPS, the response times, and all that.
I probably feel that microservices and that sort of architecture lives more naturally with the technical team. So that would be a case where I would be, again, because I can't basically advise on microservices, I wouldn't. But I do think that naturally lives a bit more with them because, again, I don't think it has, yes, it will impact on response times, but really I think that's where their expertise should lie. So I think that one would be more on their side.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks, John. If you don't mind sharing your screen again, and
Sure.
then take it away.
Okay, great. Okay, just where else? Great. Okay, yeah. So yeah, this comes into then I think we sort of have just discussed it there, but build versus buy. For me, and I don't think I'm the only one in this community, but projects can be quite stressful. They're full of risk. They're full of unknowns. So for me, the way I look at it is components can help with risk. So again, by taking this sort of component-based thinking and using things that have been done before, plugging them in such a way is that hopefully that can sort of minimize and just helps you thinking back to that building block concept, can sort of think, okay, well, so again, I would be looking to say, okay, this screen is the same as this screen is the same as this screen. Obviously, it's got different endpoints from a data perspective or whatever it might be, but it should allow you to sort of prioritize your backlog and the issues that you need to work on with that. I think you also need to have a bit of a thought into the future as well in terms of maintainability, improvements. If you build your own. Again, I personally have been involved in some times when we've gone and built stuff in-house and the effort has been, very underestimated and the end product has been really not quite as good as, not as good as what could have been available, commercially in the market. So I think it can be a common mistake is that, oh, we build it ourselves just because you can. And I've just, again, trying to think about what are the takeaways from what I'm trying to talk about here today. It's basically, have an honest sort of conversation with yourself around how much of your system are you building yourself when really you don't necessarily need to, and just really ask that question, because from what I've seen, we all tend to do it. I mean, that seems to be human nature. So really it comes back to identifying and focusing on your USP. So what's the thing that's going to make you different, and how much of your development effort are you spending on these things? And I've done a lot of big projects, and unfortunately I don't think it's often enough. Cool. So again, then obviously, and you can see that this type of thinking and this type of approach obviously bleeds into lots of different areas as well. So where is design in all of this? So again, hopefully you've got a common thread coming through in these. The message I think that I hope that I'm sort of bringing across is that you just need to be having conversations about these types of things with both sort of from the design stage and also into the development stage. And you need to be clear in your own mind around what you want your things to do, what you want your system to do, what you want your components to do. And I think there's no harm in sharing that with your design team. So again, I've experienced sort of working prototypes through to screenshot or to mock-up through to envision. But I think if it's feasible, I think you should really be asking your design teams to really incorporate implementation into a style library. So bring them through what are particularly things like drop downs, again, date pickers, etc. Like bring them through what the options are, so that it can, again, you have this concept of you're solving that question once, and then you're moving kind of more forward with with those. So when they're putting in building a mock-up, it could be, okay, right, this is going to be, you know, I don't know, you call it drop down one, and drop down one in the style library says it's this drop down and it uses this library or this plugin or whatever it is. And hopefully what you'll find then is that you know, you can actually start to apply a similar mindset to design and UX. And one of the things that you know, I've kind of been sort of thinking about it. So again, just recently completed a really big project, and one of the things that jumps to mind is how much of the wireframing and of the design stage, you know, did we overdo it in that? Did we really need to design every screen in the system? No, we didn't do every screen in the system, but you know what I'm saying? Versus really, there's probably 5, 10 really core interactions, really core sort of, yeah, again, thinking of those building blocks where a lot more of our time should have been spent on those, and really rather than actually looking at some of the other screens, which are more kind of functional screens, call it. So I think it's this sort of component-based thinking, I think, is something that can actually be applied to other areas of the system. And really it's about saying, right, if I was to boil this down into, I'm only allowed to boil this down into 5 points, 10 points. Like what are the 5 really main things that I should really be thinking of? I'm a big believer kind of in the power of constraints, and I think by sort of thinking about your designs in that same way, I think you can actually get a lot. You can get a lot of the important elements of your system mapped out in the design, without having to go into sort of maybe quite as much detail. Right. So I put forward this wonderful new way of thinking. So what's the payback for all of this? So why do we do it? And I think at times, you know, I think there's a lot of work for product managers to do. I'm obviously preaching to the choir with this message, but I think, you know, so you do have to think about a lot of things. You do have to try and do a bit of forward thinking and sort of almost predict what your users are going to need. But for me, what I think, I sort of feel like you should have like an iceberg approach, where the development is the tip of the iceberg. So, you know, when it gets to, and this is putting aside things where you need to run spikes, or you need to do R&D, whatever it might be. But really, when you need to do as much of the work as you can, help with as many of the decisions as you can along the way, until it gets to the point that when the piece of work is ready to go to the development team, you've answered a lot of those questions already. Now, you know, through doing this, I think you can engage with your team. You're engaging with your development teams earlier into the piece, so you are having conversations along the way. But hopefully, what the payback for all this is that, you know, you're not finding out midway through, as I did, that you can't paginate, or you're not finding out that, you know, you don't have a system that has one drop down looks like this and another drop down looks like this, and there's no kind of coherent sort of feel for the users. The payback is that, yeah, you avoid refactoring, and I've had to do I've literally paid for this in refactoring. I've had to pull out components because they won't do one tiny little thing that I just have to do. And you know, so you sort of think like a conversation at the very start, and it often happens at the start of the project, you pick your components and, you know, whatever it may be, but like I've had to deal with these things. I've had to face up to these sort of, you do pay the price if you don't have these conversations. And really, ultimately, what I think and what I believe you get is that you get better features quicker. So ultimately, your users are getting, you know, they are getting better features, and those things are being delivered, you know, quicker for them. I think you're also potentially, you know, as you're working on your product, these components are also improving theirs and offering new features, and and often you can actually deliver those features to your customers quite quickly, which obviously is always with minimum development time, which obviously can be very advantageous, allowing you to catch up on some other things as well. So yeah, I think there is a payback for all of this advanced thinking. So current state of the art. This is just a really quick summary of kind of what I'm currently using. So I think, as I mentioned, in my current system, looking at, it's quite grid heavy, data grid heavy. So we have a lot of those, a lot of screens where we use different data grids. I think you know what data grid I'm using. I don't need to tell you. We've also got a charting plugin that we use. And also we spend quite a bit of time on looking at our fields, so our date pickers and our drop-down lists, and all those different bits and pieces. Just to sort of make you aware of what's out there, is that there are full UI kits where you can go and purchase full kits where they give you lots of examples of lots of different things, which again could be excellent for standardizing your and allowing you to be more tightly defined when you're actually you're creating your tickets and doing your work for your development team. And again, depending on the size of your organization, certainly, I've started to see where you're actually choosing organization-wide component libraries. And again, the advantage you have there is that you've got people moving between projects and able to pick things up quickly. And I suppose really, as I say, it just keeps coming back to this idea of, do you want to be spending your time wiring up custom-built maps, or do you want to be spending your time, building whatever it is your special sauce? So in summary, and hopefully I'm good for time, but I would say, don't be like me. Don't be like the younger version of me. Educate yourself. So these things are out there. With all these talks, I don't think there's so much information stuff available now. Take what is useful for you. But just be aware of what's out there. Break down your system into components. So, you can do this with a new system, you can do this with an existing system. And I think it's really quite a useful exercise to go through, where you just simply say, all right, well, actually, if I was to break this apart and put it back together, what are the blocks of my system? And, it'd be interesting to look at, or how many of those are kind of custom built. Because the other thing you have as well is that, that is going to require maintenance into the future. It may often be also be a place where you've got sort of in-house knowledge, which potentially puts you at risk for that person to leave. I've sort of seen all the different, I've seen it all from kind of entirely hand rolled to much more component based stuff, and I think we all have sort of tech debt sort of skeleton in our closet, and often it can be very bespoke pieces of functionality. So I think that's an interesting exercise to do. And then I think the final piece is really trying to find your blend, like trying to find the way, how can you engage with your design as the UX is being done? Can you involve them in some of these decisions, and really, finding a way that you can get appropriate input from them? And similarly, how can you work with your development team so that really, again, I'll always say, like, for me, product management is about making a sort of a frictionless machine where you can take something from an idea through to execution in your system. And I believe that this method of thinking and this selection of really building on other people's hard work can allow you to remove some of that friction, and hopefully giving you a smoother development experience. And I really believe that's at the heart of a really successful software company, is being able to get your units of work through your system as frictionlessly as possible.
Awesome. Thank you, John. We've got a couple questions, not a ton of time, but
okay, great.
Let's try to get to all of them. I'll start with Syed.
Hi, John. So I have a question that, let's say you inherited a badly built product, and you have the option to either make improvements to the product or rebuild from scratch. I was wondering if you can kind of explain and justify the factors you would use in deciding either of the two options that I just mentioned. So
So, yeah, I faced this question like many times, and again, rebuild from scratch are words that are, fill me with some level of dread, I would say, because they're often so. I certainly would go through this concept of looking at things, sort of, breaking it down into different components. Look very closely at can you refactor certain elements of it? Can you introduce, could you do it on a kind of modular basis and start to, I think inevitably, like these the bigger the project, the more risk. And I'm very risk focused, I would say. So, yeah, I would fully explore the option to not to rebuild from scratch, basically. And then if you have to, then just be as honest as you can about how do you really need, which bits do you really need? Try and get some data in there as well around, because I really think that we all have inherent biases as product managers. We all build the stuff that we want to build, versus so just be really aware of those biases.
At which point would you, let's say, decide that, okay, we just have to start over?
I mean, that's a very open-ended, broad question.
No, I'm sorry. No, we face a similar situation, and then we are still like in a quandary as to what to do, because it's our tool is spaghetti code.
Yeah.
And then I guess our manager wants us to work, but the developer's opinion is it's just easier to rebuild the entire thing. So we're kind of stuck. That's what I was asking.
I mean, like there's probably lots of opinions even in this group, and it's a question that we face a lot. I would say that the starting from scratch always seems like a really appealing sort of, everything's going to be wonderful in the new world, and we're going to have this great new code. It's all going to be fast, and I don't want to sound cynical and say you're just going to inherit new problems, but just go into it with your eyes open, which is, you're going to have to rebuild a lot of stuff, and you're going to underestimate the thousands of hours that have gone into your current system. Yes, it may well have spaghetti code, but you're going to see bugs again that you thought you'd never see again, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, but equally you have to keep on have to keep up to date with modern frameworks, and because you need for recruitment and all that kind of stuff. So I'm sorry I can't give you like a direct answer, but just
you did give me some insights, so thank you.
Okay, rebuild it from scratch. There you go. Easy answer. just don't blame me.
We've also got a question from Candice.
Hi, John. I have a question around, so what kind of the key data points you would have collected along with measuring the progress of the components, and then like what are criteria actually to choose those the data points to collect?
I wouldn't say that I really would have data points in this scenario. Insofar as this for me is kind of before you're launching your system. I think it's, or before you're launching a particular feature. So for me, it's more you could look perhaps at a sort of what an estimate of time would be to build the functionality yourself versus what the actual cost of a component might be, and look at some sort of developer per hour cost, something like that. But I again would be very careful to look out for bias there against I have this unfortunate trait of being optimistic as a product manager, so I always think everything's not going to take as long as it does. So I think just be really careful of that one. Potentially as you launch your product, then I think then the data points becomes a bit more pertinent.
Awesome. Thank you, John, for today's discussion of a guide to components for product managers. Really, really thoughtful, really, really cool topic. Appreciate that. As always, the presentation will be posted on our SlideShare channel. Big thank you from me, Nis Frome, today's mentor lead and moderator for the webcast, and to everyone who joined today here on Zoom as well as on YouTube. Don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor like John, and like many of the people here, to visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today. If you're looking to fill a product job, or if you're looking for one, visit the jobs board at theproductjobs.com. And that's all for now. Thank you.
Nis, I have a quick question. Is that
Sure.
the end of our live streaming today, or is there one
Nope.
at 12:45?
Yep, we've got one more.
Okay.
Well, no, we've got a bunch more. Sorry, we've got one right after this.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris is next. I believe Chris is here.
Yep, I'm here.
Where? The second someone talks, Zoom moves them in the participant list. So let's see. There you are, Chris. I just spotlighted you to prove that you exist.
Thanks. How's it going, everybody?
Yeah. Going well. Zoom works like a charm. Just some quirks here and there.
I'm finished, so I feel great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Let's go to gallery view.
You know what? One thing I would just throw out there about the large system that you need to replace is one of my favorite laws. It's called Gall's law, and Gall's law is basically that you can't create a complex system. You can only evolve a complex system from a simple one. And so I think that's why like monolith projects fail all the time, is that you're trying to replace this thing that had taken 20 years or 10 years to finally get to the state that it was with all of its quirks and nuance, and then you're just trying to replace it, basically. So I don't know. I just don't think it's possible personally. I think you'd have to do it component by component, but that's me. And when I say component, it depends on what you mean by component as well, right? Like I worked on something with philosophy where they had built this system that was essentially like a system for doing like intelligence analysis, and they had built it over 10 years. It was built in PHP before there were like frameworks available. And so whoever wrote it was a genius, basically, but like they were too much of a genius. Like we couldn't figure out how to maintain the code for this company. And so we had to like take a piece of functionality or like a particular part of that site, that service, and break it off and rebuild it. And we had to actually build abstraction layers to their database so that we wouldn't screw up the way things work today. And then eventually we got to a case where we were, rather than their old database being the master, our new database was the master, which was way more efficient. And so we had to like do this piece by piece, like removal and replacement. And it took a while to get to that state, but it doesn't work out as quickly as you'd like. You can't just replace a big system with itself, right? But yeah.
Awesome. We're going to get started with the second talk in a moment. Chris, just confirming your talk is about alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog.
Yep, that's right.
Awesome.
I'm going to try not to be too self-referential because I've done two talks on one talk on strategy, one talk on roadmaps, but
recall in slide 4 of my earlier presentation.
Exactly.
Just a reminder, everyone, keep your video on, yourself muted until called on. I will call on everyone again to introduce themselves. Make sure you've got no other windows open during that time. Don't use the Zoom meeting chat. We did a good job on YouTube, lots of questions. Let's pester Chris with questions as well. And Chris, obviously you've done this now probably 7 to 10 times, so you know the drill, but power through any technical mistakes. Don't ask if we can hear you, assume we can. All right, beyond that, you know the drill.
Yep.
We'll get started in 1 minute. There may be a gap after this talk as an FYI. Scott had to reschedule. I will let everyone know if there's an adjustment to the calendar based on that, but just, I guess, wait to hear after this. I have not heard anything yet.
I saw that email come through earlier today.
Yeah, we didn't get another one after that, right?
There's so Yogesh is after. I thought he was going to be after. Still.
Yogesh is at 1 p.m. still. Yeah, there's still a 1 p.m., a 2 p.m., and a 3 p.m. We're going to see if one of those gets rescheduled for 12 p.m.
I get it. Cool.
But I have not heard yet.
I haven't heard either. Let me see.
Okay. Gonna go to speaker view, gonna come over to me. All right. Hey everyone, it's Sunday, August 11th, 2019, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today, we are joined by one of our mentors, Chris Butler, to lead a talk on the alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog. I'm going to briefly explain the format, and then we'll move over to introductions of everyone here. So the Product Mentor Program was started about 6-7 years ago by Jeremy Horn. It matches product leaders, experienced product veterans with product managers, folks who aspire to be product managers, who get better at product management. It's a mentorship program. It's got 2 sessions every year. Today on Zoom, we're joined by a bunch of our mentors and mentees, as well as on YouTube by listeners around the world. If everyone could wave hi real quick. Let me see that I got that right. There, one more time. Awesome. And we're going to go around the room and do introductions. If everyone could state their name, location, role, and whether they are a mentor or mentee. Let's start with Alex.
Hey guys, I'm Alex. I'm a product manager for a company called LexisNexis in London, and I'm a mentee.
Awesome. Let's move over to Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Postelnick. I'm a product mentor in this program. I've been product manager for 6 years. I currently work as a product manager at Angie's List, based in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Awesome. Let's move over to Carlos.
So hello everyone, my name is Carlos. I'm calling from Madrid, Spain. I work for a company called Mr. Yev, operating mainly in South America, in 14 countries in South America. My mentor is Nis Frome, I'm mentee.
Awesome. Let's move over to Chris.
Hey, I'm Chris Butler, and I'm a chief product architect at IPsoft, which is an IT automation company. And I'm usually based out of New York, but I'm in Oakland, California right now, and I'm a mentor. I've been a mentor for quite a number of seasons.
Awesome. Let's move over to Daniel.
Hey, my name is Daniel Ponsigny. I'm a mentee based out of Toronto, work at a company called Modo Insight.
Awesome. And John.
I'm John Masterson, and I'm the Chief Product Officer for ImproveWell, a startup in London, and I'm a mentor.
And Marvin.
Hey everyone, my name is Marvin Matthew. I'm the head of product and strategy at a cryptocurrency startup called Bitsian in New York City, and I'm a mentee.
Nicola.
Hey, I'm Nicola. I'm based in Copenhagen. I work at 2021 AI. I'm a mentee, and my mentor is Yogesh.
Syed.
Hi, everyone. I am based out of New York City. I am joining Verizon as senior product owner. I'm a mentee, and my mentor is Brian.
Vivek.
Hi, everyone. This is Vivek from Bangalore. I'm part of the product group in Resume, and I'm a mentee.
Yogesh.
Hi, I'm Yogesh, and I'm a senior product manager at Omnicom Health Group, and I'm a mentor here, and I'm located in New York City.
Awesome. And last but not least, Candace.
Hi, I'm Candace Zhang, and I'm based in New Jersey. I'm actually a mentee in this program. So I'm currently head of product management in a company called 10-4.
Awesome. And swinging back to me, I am Nis Frome. I'm the mentor lead and the moderator for today's talk on today's live stream. And now, without further ado, we're going to hand it over to Chris Butler to do his talk. Chris, take it away.
Great, thank you. And yeah, so what I'm going to be talking about today is the alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog. And maybe just very quickly about me again, Chief Product Architect at IPsoft. I've been part of the product mentorship program for quite a number of seasons and have about 19 years of product and business development experience. And that includes places like Microsoft, Waze, Kayak. I've worked also at places like Philosophy, which is a design consultancy. And then I even had my own company at a certain point. And this is my email address if you want to get in contact with me after this, and then my Twitter handle. So the alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog, what I'm really trying to get at during this presentation is, what are these things? And I'm not going to dive as deep as I usually would into each of these individually, but I think talking about what are some of the really the right ways to deal with them, or the right ways to do them, and then how are some of the ways that people go wrong with them, I think is really important. And then I want to talk about alignment, which is something that I think we talk about as product people a lot of the time, but we don't really practice it as much as I think we should, or focus on it as much as we should. And so, what are these things, right? Really, at a very high level, strategy is to me really the key problem that we're solving, and why us. The roadmap is how do we prioritize these sub problems that we have to solve, and then what is the focus work, from a backlog standpoint? What is the focus work that we're doing right now? And so let's start with strategy. So at a very high level, there's lots of terminology, vision, mission. I would even say in some cases, culture, values, strategy. They all kind of try to point at the same thing, which is what is this really high level aspect of the company that we're trying to get some type of alignment on. I really like John Boyd's definition of this. And John Boyd was a strategist. He's most well known for the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, act, which is like a proto build, measure, learn, or really any other type of decision-making loop you could find out there. And what he really says is that, the real goal of strategy is to survive and survive on our own terms, and to be able to improve our capacity for independent action. And so he makes this definition outside of the definition of a competitor, but he also has a definition which says that if you have a competitor, you're also trying to now limit their ability to take independent action. And so I like this a lot because it points to the fact that, we're not, when we talk about strategy in very particular words, it's not about a particular feature, but it's about how are we enabling ourselves to do these types of features. And I was recently listening to a podcast by the chief people officer at HubSpot, and they were talking a lot about culture. And one of the things that was most interesting to me was they talked about culture being the one thing that they agree on within an organization. And the way I would extend that is I would say that it really sounded an awful lot like they were talking about strategy to me. And I think strategy, when we think about it inside an organization, it's the one thing that we all agree on, that we all, it's basically the immutable truth that we have. It doesn't mean we always have to, it doesn't mean that strategy doesn't change, but just that it's the one thing we all agree on, but that we can disagree about absolutely everything else. And I think this is key when we talk about how, engineers, designers, and product people work together, is that they need to disagree about an awful lot. But if they don't agree on the strategy, there's a lot of problems that start to be caused because of that. And one book that I really like to recommend, and I've recommended this a couple times before, but it's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And by Richard Rummel, really smart person. He's done an awful lot of work around strategy and analysis of strategy by people. So I'm going to dive into this just like a little bit, because I think it's important and interesting to understand. In this way of talking about good strategy and bad strategy, he's really inspired me to look at what are the things that point out badness within a strategy, and actually later on within roadmaps and backlogs. So some of the strategy anti-patterns that come from Rummel's work, as well as some things that I've seen, are the following. So the first one he talks about is really failure to face the challenge. So a strategy that is has no problem that it's trying to solve and doesn't really go directly at the problem itself is not very valuable, right? Like if you're doing something that is just the solution itself, that's not really a strategy, that's a solution. I think if you mistake goals and planning for strategy, that's another anti-pattern that he's identified. So just saying that you're going to increase your revenue by 30% every year is not a strategy, that's a goal. And the way that strategy goals are different is that strategy is about how are we all aligning around a problem, which is like the earlier anti-pattern. And the problem with focusing on goals is that it may be over-limiting in some ways. The next thing is that it's just a list of things to do. So like if you have a strategy that says we're going to ship these 10 features, again, that's what you're going to get to is that you're still misidentifying the fact that to exist as an organization, you're there to solve a problem for someone. And it's not just to ship things. I think, the idea of a feature factory is something that is a result of this type of anti-pattern. One that I've found personally is that if you don't actually write your strategy down or you don't talk about it as a strategy to a lot of people, it ends up being everybody's individual strategy, right? Because you're not writing it down, because you're not getting alignment between people, everybody has this idea in their head of what the problem is that they're trying to solve. And usually it gets more localized than kind of generalized within the organization. And that can cause a lot of different types of features or problems being solved rather than just one. I think also not having it written down to be able to use in a bunch of different places, I think is really, really important. And I did write a post called "Your Strategy is Too Sacred," and I think this is related to there's a nuance here, which is that I think that every product manager should have something written down, but there are real problems to getting it written down when everybody believes that strategy is so sacred. And so I think you as a product person should have it written down somewhere. You should have the sentence summary, you should have the paragraph summary, and you should have a long document summary of your strategy. But it doesn't mean necessarily that you're posting it to your internal website. And I want to talk about what does it mean to actually have alignment later on. And then it's about the future rather than the present, right? A strategy is really, if you're not making it some type of thing that you can understand today, you're always going to be putting off doing something towards that strategy if it's in the future. And so while I think a lot of people conflate the idea of strategy as being very future looking, I think, yes, we could say that something like vision or mission is maybe future looking because you want a particular state of the world. But if your strategy isn't something that's helping you make decisions today, it's actually not very valuable. And then I also just love to, throw out some shade on SWOT, but I think SWOT is like a horrible tool. And the reason why I think SWOT is a horrible tool, and if people are not familiar with this, SWOT is really about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and I always blank on the last one because I never use it. But basically the strengths and weaknesses about your organization, it's really hard for you to be very unbiased about what those strengths and weaknesses are. And the truth is that when you do this type of thinking, you're kind of probably getting in alignment with everybody about some biased viewpoint of your actual system. And then finally, the one that Rommel that brings up that I really think is hilarious is fluff. So almost every not every strategy, but I've seen a lot of strategies where they say that they're going to be like best in class or world leading or something like that. And one of the things that he talks about to see whether something is fluff is to just take the opposite of something. And so, does it ever really make sense to not be the world-class type of provider in something? Or, does it make sense to really not have best-in-class customer service? And I always like to make a joke that maybe, Spirit Air or something like that banks on that model. But I think it's very rare that being the best at something is not what you want to do as a strategy. So what is a good strategy, right? And I think, I've done, this is actually not just this is not a product mentor talk within a product mentor talk, but I did a talk back in season 6 about basically strategy for agile environments. And so I would reference that. But when we talk about good strategy, Richard Rommel has talked about it where you need to break it into really 3 key components. And the first component is really some type of diagnosis. And this diagnosis is an explanation of the nature of the challenge. And so when I say challenge, I mean, what is the thing you're solving for someone out there? And part of that is why is this, why is this problem important to solve? Who has it maybe? And then an explanation of it, essentially. The next level down is really, why are we special to solve it, right? the guiding policy is an approach to solve this using whatever our resources or benefits or kind of, moats or whatever we want to talk about it. What is special about us solving this particular thing, or what is the policy for that? And then linking that directly to coherent actions, which is like steps we're taking within our organizations. And that could be building things, but it could also be the way we set up our organizations. And so strategy kernel, I think, is a really effective tool or kind of framework to understand what is a good strategy. And so really briefly, as an example, right? This is a bit of a toy example, but the idea of a doctor's kernel, right? So like a doctor, there are a set of kind of signs, symptoms together with a history, and there's some type of diagnosis that it needs to make. So it's like it's this type of disease or it's this type of pathology, right? Once you have that challenge that you're now trying to solve as a doctor, you need to decide a therapeutic approach. And so there's different schools of thought within medicine about how to do things. And then finally, you take action in some way. So that could be prescriptions, it could be diet, it could be particular therapies. And so in the end, the doctor is really linking all of these things from a very high level challenge, which is that set of that diagnosis essentially, all the way down to the particular things that the patient needs to do. And so maybe taking a bigger example, this is one that's referenced in the book, which I like to use. And NVIDIA is a graphics chip manufacturer. When Rummel wrote this book, he was really looking at the fact that during the 90s, there was a change from kind of use of 3D cards for multimedia, which was usually because, back then we didn't have computers that really did graphics very well, to a case where people were doing a lot of 3D gaming. And so NVIDIA, they were trying to make this change to 3D gaming, but they had, 3DFX was a competitor that had owned the market for a little while for that type of segment. And then they saw Intel was going to start getting to it. And so they were trying to consider what could they do to actually improve their chances within the market through a strategic means. And so what they did, and there's a lot of text, but I'll walk you through it. I mean, basically, the real diagnosis was that because there's an emerging 3D gaming market, the more that those gamers always wanted more power, right? They wanted more ability to do higher and higher end graphics, and the game manufacturers were depending on that. So whatever they could build, there was a market out there that would buy it, right? And if they basically with these other competitors, if they were able to provide these cards, NVIDIA would not be able to gain the market share that it had because there's always like another buying opportunity essentially. And so their guiding policy was really to break out of this 18-month development cycle. And where this comes from is the 18-month cycle was because of Moore's law, right? Is that just for whatever reason, all the different card manufacturers had settled on the fact that every 18 months they were coming out with a different card. And what they decided to do from an NVIDIA standpoint was to break out each of the teams into a different 6-month cycle. And what that meant was that they'd be releasing cards every 6 months that if someone wanted to buy a new card because they needed more power for a game that had come out, NVIDIA would have usually the fastest, most kind of current card available in the market. And the way that they then did this was through a bunch of different coherent actions. And that included 3 development teams working in parallel. They started to pull kind of drivers and away from all of the different hardware manufacturers so that they could own that. They had to create actually an abstraction layer between the drivers that the chip manufacturers would make and what they would have. They then started to outsource fabrication, and then finally they sold to computer makers rather than board makers. And so all of these things together really meant that in the end, NVIDIA became the quintessential seller of these cards, and NVIDIA, and Intel ended up losing, didn't end up really gaining much market when they tried to enter into the 3D graphics market. And so, of course, this is an example from a long time ago, and people that are now joining the workforce may not even, they may know NVIDIA, but probably more as NVIDIA as a like AI and machine learning card use or a Bitcoin mining use. I'm sure people still buy NVIDIA cards for gaming, but it's one of those things where all of this happened like a long time ago, right? So what I try to do, and again, this is what my assumption about Airbnb's kernel would be. So I'm kind of doing a post hoc analysis of this. They probably didn't use a kernel tool to do this, but I just want to make sure that it's clear that, how would we break up what Airbnb does, right? So my diagnosis is that there's a lack of liquidity in the short-term stay market that keeps travelers staying at high-price hotels, right? So because of this issue that hotels have been around for a very long time. People have owned places or rented places for a very long time that has extra rooms. And so there's a lot of waste when it comes to vacancy of just an actual room within any area. And so what they thought was that building a marketplace that then takes advantage of this, this inefficiency to be able to connect guests with these hosts that are willing to give their, rent their rooms out. That was really their policy. And they believed that they could get over any of what, they were not held back by the idea of trust or safety concerns in those cases. But some of the coherent actions that they would then take is, a very simple booking experience to make it more like hotels. Being able to have a guest and a host provide feedback on each other to keep the marketplace fair, and then removing bad actors. And then one I just like to throw in for this as well is that they basically ignored local tourism taxes and policies as a coherent action, right? Like they did not work with cities up front. They did not ask for permission. They just did things, and then eventually they have to work with them. And so that's kind of my analysis of how we break this out. So I think the kernel is really a really effective way to talk about what is good strategy. And the next thing I would say is that strategies are really mental models, right? So when we think about a mental model within your organization, or what a mental model is, Charlie Munger talks about this a lot, right? So if the facts, don't hang together on a latticework of theory, you don't have them in a usable form. And a mental model is how do you view the world, and then how do you make decisions on it based on some, basically heuristic to be able to do that. And so I think, one of the things we don't consider a lot of the time is that, especially as part of an alignment step between all of the different functions, is that if people don't in some way really get at a deep level what your mental model, what your strategy is, they will not be taking actions when they're not around you as a product person based on that strategy. And so mental models are a way to kind of load that into your head. And it's something that I think, Charlie Munger has talked about an awful lot. And also Farnham Street is another great blog that talks about mental models in general. And what's interesting about this is that you can also start to compress these mental models into almost sayings. And so there's a great article by an ex-strategist from Amazon, and he would talk about JPEGing your strategy, I think is what the title was called. And what Jeff Bezos would do is that every year or two, he would create a new kind of saying, and there would be a huge unveiling of the strategy or the problem we're trying to solve as Amazon. And that strategy would, have something like a half-hour to hour-long presentation of evidence, a lot of information about what is the problem, how we actually, and they would not put it in these terms necessarily, but like, how are we meant to solve this? And then what are maybe some of the coherent actions we're actually going to do? And then what they would have is they would really have a saying that would tie all this together, so that whenever they're having a conversation internal to the organization, they could just do this. And so getting our house in order was really about like fixing all of the systems we had. Another one was that they use, actually still a lot of the time, is that it's day one, right? Like this is the first release of the product, now go out and fix it. And so they use this method an awful lot, right? Like how do you make it so that your strategy can be referenceable just by a saying, or, in the case of Melinda Gates, in the Melinda Gates Foundation, they basically will compress it down to one word. And so while you may get a lot of variability under what the word gentle would mean to you, there's still all of this discussion you've had around what is gentle within this organization. And so I think that's really powerful. And I would definitely say that's important when we talk about this type of stuff. So that's everything I wanted to talk about as far as strategy. I mean, we have a lot of ground to cover with roadmaps and backlogs. So I'm not going to dive too much deeper into this, but I wanted to give kind of like an overview of where I believe strategy should be and some of the anti-patterns I've seen for strategy.
Hey, Chris, before you get into that, we've got a question, which is really great. You just mentioned, let me stop your sharing here. You mentioned that Amazon does this every year and a half. We've got a question from Vivek. Let me just spotlight him so he can ask his question.
Hey Chris. So we talk about strategy, right? How far in future you should think about when you're thinking about strategy? Because ultimately the company's vision remains same. What changes the strategy, as you mentioned, right? So what is a good time?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the problems that I see a lot of the time with the way that strategy is built, is that it's about some future state rather than you're solving problems today. So, I think it's fine if you want to talk about the idea of vision being here's the end state of the world as we see it in 5 or 10 years, right? And I appreciate the fact that as a product manager, one of our key mental models is looking for an end state and then working backwards, right? But what I would say is that the strategy is actually not meant to tell you how, like, what that future thing is. What it's meant to tell you is what is the actual problem we're trying to solve today. And so it is it's supposed to be timeless to me. Like that's, I think, a really, really important aspect. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't plan like 5 years out. Like if there's an end vision state that you have that's 5 years out, how do you plan for that is a different activity, right? Like that's where you then start to break up these, like, what do I have to do before I do this, right? What do I have to do before this? And those are components that then you start to see you have to build. But I would also argue that, like, do you even know that the problem you're trying to solve is worth solving based on the way you want to solve it? And so that to me is where you're trying to shorten your cycles of decision making to be able to go and basically have decision, so prototyping, the idea of user research, these are all things that are trying to shorten decision cycles for us rather than having to depend on kind of releasing to the market, right? Which is that's the right way to do it, right? Because that's the end goal is you want to sell something to a customer or to a client or something like that. But you can learn about things and you can reduce your risk and uncertainty way earlier before that. So that's all I'd say. I just want to reiterate that, like, again, strategy is really meant to be a decision-making framework for you right now. It's supposed to help you make a decision between two hard choices. If a decision is ever, like, if you ever have a strategy, again, this gets back to fluff, right? Like, the strategy is not like we're going to be the worst company ever or the best company ever, right? Like that's kind of a no-brainer. Like at least I would say that it's, maybe no-brainer is not fair, but it's like, it's very rare that you ever have that type of like black and white, good and bad type of thing. It's always about gray areas. So it should be more about like, what are these really hard decisions we need to make? And how do we build a strategy to let those people do a better job of making those decisions?
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Awesome. We have another question from Alex. You're muted, Alex, sorry.
Cool, cheers. My question was around, do you ever externalize your strategy? So I guess with your vision and your roadmap, that's more customer facing and kind of helps get them on board with where you're trying to get to. Would you do that as well with your strategy, or is that more internal?
I think if it's helpful, right? Like, again, not a lot of people actually expose their full vision. I mean, some people like Elon Musk is famous for basically exposing his grand vision around a lot of things. And so I would say it depends on your industry. And I would say it depends on what your customers need to make decisions, right? So the reason why people externalize roadmaps a lot of the time is because they want to be able to sell to customers that need something that they don't have yet, right? And so it's like a proof point that, hey, I'm actually thinking about this. And we'll get it to eventually. I want to talk about timeframes and roadmaps, so we'll get to that in a second. But vision is another interesting one. I think if it helps your customer make a decision to buy with you, then that is an appropriate time to externalize your vision. Yeah.
Cool. Take it away, Chris.
All right. So now that we're done with strategy, let's talk about roadmaps. So I made this. I thought it was funny. I don't know if anybody else thinks it's funny, but this is going to be, I think, one of the only memes in this actual presentation. I try to limit myself to one at a time. But I think a lot of people think of roadmaps in a very particular way, and I think that they're probably wrong, personally. So what are the basics, right? It's usually just a list of bigger things to address. So we'll talk about the smaller things to address, which is the backlog. It's ordered by priority to be addressed, and it's actually shared within the team in some way. Usually it's to get alignment between these teams. And then when we talk about the future, so like the roadmap is meant to be this kind of like time frame to the future. And so as we move out further and further into the future, means that things get less and less certain. And so let's talk about what good road mapping is. So I believe in a very particular camp of road mapping, and I'll talk about that means. And so take this as you will, but I think this is like a very valuable way to do good road mapping. And this comes from a post by Jared Spool about themes and thematic road mapping. Basically, themes and thematic road mapping is a way to, if we now start with the assumption that our strategy is solving a key challenge, what are the challenges below that challenge, or that make up that challenge, or interact with that challenge, that we should solve in some piecemeal way to understand whether we can solve the bigger challenge? And so themes are really meant to be that thing where rather than say, epics or something like that, it's not exactly what he means. And I'll talk about some anti-patterns in a second. But it's really about like, what are these big pieces of the problem that we want to solve in some priority order? And so I believe this is actually a really great way to do it rather than feature oriented. And so I've also written a post about this, being very specific. And I've done a talk about it as well, if you're interested. Actually, that's a horrible time to take a screenshot of me, but I did for some reason. And then, so let's use this as an example of pointing out a lot of the things that I think are good about a roadmap. And so this is an example I put together for thematic roadmaps. And so you can see here that I've really broken it into 4 buckets. And the last bucket I actually only have when we're doing planning. So it's really about what are we doing now, what are we doing next, and what are we doing later. And so in the thematic kind of discussion, most of it has really just been around like, how are we forming these things as problems in some type of stack ranking? But what I guess I've realized is that over time, we tend to operate on multiple themes at the same time, especially when we have a team that is a bit larger. And then also, we know what is maybe ready to work on versus what we want to do but is not ready to work on. And that's why I've added these timeframes. And then what I also like to say is that there's an interesting kind of confidence and likelihood about which of these things are actually going to happen. Or maybe if you want to put it another way, like which of these things are certain versus uncertain, more certain versus less certain. And so the now is something that we're working on right now. Like we're pretty sure it's going to happen. Like unless we find some major snafu in the way that we're going to implement this, we will actually do this project, right? Next is things that we prepared or we've been preparing for or understand better. We've done a lot of research on. We know that this is a high priority and we should take care of it next. And then later is really things that we know we want to do after these things, but that we haven't really done enough work yet, or it hasn't come up to be a priority enough. And then the to be considered I use as a column, which is usually empty, other than when we want to basically create some time to realign the roadmap. A lot of the time we'll have a meeting around this and we'll then have a list of other problems we should consider. And so I'll put those in the to be considered pile. And the reason why is that it's really about how do we now interact with management to allow for placing these things. So that's kind of an overall overview of how I think about road mapping and what is good road mapping. And then, of course, what I want to get into now is really like, what are some of the problems that people have with road mapping a lot of the time? And this will be illustrative of what I think is a good roadmap. And so this is a Bruce McCarthy post who's done a lot of talking about road mapping. He was the original person that came up with thematic road mapping that Jared Spool then referenced. But he has a great dirty dozen of kind of roadmap roadblocks, and then I've added a bunch that I've seen as well. So the first one is conflating strategy, mission, or vision with roadmaps, right? A roadmap is really that list of problems we're going to solve, almost not exactly a list of things to do, but it's very close to that, right? And so a roadmap is not a strategy. If someone asks for your strategy and you give them a roadmap, you're basically just telling them what features are you going to ship. Not exactly, but that's kind of where we're getting at, right? If you're not linking the strategy to the roadmap, that is also very problematic. And I think this gets to the point around alignment, right? Is that if you have a strategy that you're working on and you say that this is the mental model that you're going to use to solve problems, but the roadmap is based on a completely different set of things to work on, when the person has that mental model to make a decision, they're going to make decisions that don't make sense between those two things. If it's all about features, I know I mentioned that really briefly earlier, but I think if it's about features, you're missing the point of the roadmap. Now, there's some nuance around this particular anti-pattern, right? Like in some cases, I have had to create feature-based roadmaps for, I guess like sales and marketing types of activities. But I think, and I think Intercom has talked about this a little bit, that part of that just points at a dysfunction between in the relationship between product and marketing and sales. In that, something that I do at IPsoft is that a lot of the salespeople want to sell the features of this conversational agent that we build, right? But the thing that I'm trying to, I constantly am a broken record about is that here's the types of problems that conversational agents in general will solve, and in particular, our type of conversational agent will solve. So I guess what I've learned over time is that it shouldn't be about features. Your roadmap should not be about features. But if you're constantly being asked, well, hey, I just need to know what to sell, or I need to know what to market, that really points at a dysfunction that you're not bringing them on board with being problem oriented. And in the end, consumers really care about their problems and about how you're going to change them from one state to another, rather than what your particular solution is, even if they say that that's the case. The next thing is inside out thinking. So really being focused on a roadmap that is based on what you want rather than what your customers want, right? You should be always focusing on what it is, what's the hottest topic or the biggest need that your customers have, and how do you give that to them, rather than what you believe is really the problem. And I think this is a little bit related to the fact that sometimes technical debt will show up on roadmaps or even backlogs as just itself, right? You should never, in my opinion, and I realize this might be controversial, you should never address technical debt unless there's a user benefit, right? And if anything, if technical debt can sit there for a while and it just seems to work, I would even argue maybe that code is not necessary. You should get rid of that feature. Anyways, I have a lot of obscure and extreme feelings about these types of things, but inside out is a really important one, I think, for road mapping. If you're not building things for your customer, you're not prioritizing for your customer through your roadmap, you're going to see dysfunction further down the line in your backlog. The roadmap should also not be a backlog, right? It should not be an icebox of ideas. Someone was asking me about, I was in a planning meeting, and they were like, well, so where are we going to put this work item that doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing right now? And so I then basically wrote backlog and icebox on a trash can. And to illustrate a point, I thought it was very funny. But in the end, like, the roadmap is not where you collect things, right? It's not meant to be this huge list. It's not meant to be the backlog that you then provide to the to-do list. That's not what it's meant to be. And if you do that at that level, if you are just collecting other people's ideas, you're just going to have a huge list of things that don't matter, basically. And then it should not be carefully set by the product person alone, right? The roadmap is actually the combination of everybody working together, just like the backlog is. And so I tend to have an opinion, this may be from the fact that I'm more from the balanced team roots, but it's that, you should involve your management, you should involve engineering management, you should involve everybody that is thinking about the higher level goals of the organization in the discussion of the roadmap, basically. And if you don't, you're going to try to present something, you'll be like, ta-da, and people are like, well, what about this? And I don't like that, and I don't think this makes sense, basically. So that's it for road mapping. And I'll pause for a second here before we jump into backlogs and alignment. But I think these are kind of some things that I've seen when people try to build roadmaps, and they definitely suffer from.
Hey, Chris, we've got a question from Marvin. Give me 1 second here.
Great.
Marvin, I'll give you the spotlight.
All right. Thanks. Hey, Chris. One thing I was curious about, and something I've been having a challenge with in my organization, is getting stakeholders together on a roadmap in a really productive and effective way. So I was wondering if you had any tips or frameworks for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I would do, so we'll talk about tempo of these things in a little bit, but one project in particular where I think it worked really well was that I would actually, I think this was in particular was about a 3-week project. So I think you could expand this out to kind of mean the tempo overall, but we were doing weekly sprints, and we had basically, after a bunch of user research up ahead, and I realize that's a little bit of a gated development thing, but I also argue that maybe agile and gated development are really just different timeframes. So what we did though is we did a bunch of research, and then part of the output from the research sprints that we had done was actually a thematic roadmap. And so part of that thematic roadmap, the beginning of it at least, the way it was built was that I went through and I looked at all of the research synthesis that design had been doing. And I was also doing a lot of the research, so I was very familiar with it. But then I created a list of the problems that I think we needed to solve. And that was after also we did a strategic workshop where I have like every product person wants to become senior enough has to build a canvas. So I built a strategy canvas. And so I used this like methodology to build out the kernel for them. So I had the strategic kernel to the best of the understanding of the organization at that point, which is a brand new organization. I had all this research synthesized. I created a roadmap, or what I did before creating a roadmap was I created all of the problems that I thought were appropriate for the next kind of, whatever I thought would be like the next couple months, basically, of problems we should solve that fit underneath the strategic understanding of the organization, right? And then rather than putting them in now, next, and later, I actually put them in a huge list off to the side. I had those 3 columns right there. And I basically said, okay, here's all the research that we did. Here's kind of the high level outcomes from that research. We also sent it out to them. So there's more of like a recap. And then what we said is I said, okay, well, here's all the problems that I put together that I think are really important for us to solve. Let's review all these, right? So we went through and reviewed all of them. I put them in loose priority order. Like I didn't tell them that, but I put them in loose priority order. And then essentially what we did was I said, okay, well, so now we know what's in this backlog, or sorry, not backlog, in this roadmap, possible roadmap. Like, where do we want to put these? What's the first thing we should work on, right? What's most important? Like if we think about the strategy and we think about what we want to get done in the next 3 months, what's the most important thing? And this is where prioritization comes in, which is very interesting, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to prioritize. In our case, it was a mixture between what do we need to build to get to an MVP, and then what is also the most unknown thing that we have right now. And so we tried to balance those two within basically the prioritization. And then with everybody, I would say, okay, well, so where do we think this should go? And then everybody would kind of have a discussion. We'd place it on the backlog. And in some cases, we actually remove, the roadmap. In some cases, we remove it from the roadmap altogether if it didn't make sense. And so we did that for each of those items. And so it was really a group activity, right? It was no longer me coming up with a roadmap and then presenting it and then people shooting a bunch of holes in it. It was like if people disagreed, we had to disagree in that meeting and have a discussion about it and then place it in the roadmap. And then what we did as a way of maintenance after that was every like 4 sprints or so, like I would be moving things through the, basically I'd be pulling things from later, to next to now as we were building out different sprints. And so the list of things in later started getting less and less. And so about every month or so, in this case, we would look at I would then bring up another list of problems that we had discovered. We'd realign around the now, next, and later. And then we would rearrange them if we need to, remove them, replace them, change them, split them. I mean, all the stuff you do with like user story splitting as well comes to play here. So like, anyways, so that's what we tried to do. It was just that I would usually do all the prep work for the roadmap, but then we would do the roadmap together is maybe the way to think about it. All right.
Great. Thanks, Chris. We've got actually one more question, but I wanna keep moving here for the sake of time. So take it away.
All right, thank you. All right, great. So backlog. So what is this? It's basically the to-do list, right? I mean, that's really what it is. And what are the basics? It's a list of things to do. Each item is in some type of format appropriate for a team. So that could be a user story, a job story, whatever. It's ordered in priority to be done. So usually you're not pulling from like a mass of things, you're pulling from a list of things. And then it meets some definition of ready. And I realize that some people have either an unwritten definition of ready or you're like a Scrum person and you have a very specific definition of ready. But there's some like leveling here that says essentially, we're ready to now start working on this based on the standards of our community, right? But I also want to collect a list of controversial aspects. And I put controversial in quotes because I think they're more controversial for me than for the industry. And so I wanted to talk about them very briefly. So including estimates or points. So the idea of doing something brand new, right? And actually, I was just at Agile Alliance, the conference last week down in DC, and talked to a lot of people about the idea of estimation or using like different types of forecasting rather than estimation techniques. And so I think there's a lot to be done here. I think that the current way we do estimation is entirely too optimistic. And so I just would say that I think sometimes backlogs will include estimates. In some cases, groups that I would work on, we would already have acceptance criteria built in when we would in the backlog. And so I think this is both good and bad. Sometimes acceptance criteria is good to have before you actually know what you're doing because it helps reframe or frame in some way. But I think it also could be bad because you're over kind of setting what should be done within this work item for the team to take care of. I also think that maybe generating this list before the planning meeting, I think can be bad in some way. And same thing with the drawn from another huge list somewhere else. The biggest issue I see is that, especially for people that are truly trying to be agile, if you build a huge list somewhere else of things to do, it's your past self telling your current self what to do. And from the agile mindset standpoint is that's really bad. And the reason why that's bad is because your past self doesn't have as much knowledge as your current self does. And so I think this is why I feel the way I do about things like ice boxes as well. It's just, if something is really important, it will come up again. And so I don't understand why we build these humongous lists of things for us to do when the reality is we know what we need to do right now. And then finally, I think one of the things that some people do is they'll just put dev tasks in the backlog. And I think that's also problematic, right? Like you should be including work that the entire team is doing. And if your team includes product people and designers, you should include that. And even if it includes data scientists, you should include that, right? You want visibility between the team of what's actually going on. And here's a few other additional anti-patterns. So those are all kind of, I think, things that, you could make an argument for one way or the other, depending on the team. But here's some real anti-patterns I've found. And so, yes, having a humongous list of things to do is really, really bad, right? You should not have something that takes the product person hours and hours and hours to review and to groom on a regular basis. That's an anti-pattern. It's generated way in advance. I already talked about this. I want to just reiterate, I think this is bad, but I know that some people do this. And I think there's a real differentiation between what is the official backlog versus what is some type of idea set that people can control on their own. So I think it's absolutely fine for an engineer to write down a list of the things that they need to do to actually create some type of technology. But if it's not something that's being worked on in the near term or even like in the next couple sprints, I don't see why it should be in the backlog at all, personally. The next one is that it's full of ideas, not qualified work. I already talked about this, but it's basically ideas are not something to work on. And then also, I think, my last talk was about user research for the product mentor. And I think one of the things I've seen is that people will just take like all the findings from their research and they'll just drop it into the backlog and then they assume that turns into work items. And I think that's incorrect, right? It's you as a product person that should be the filter between all of your research findings and then the synthesis of those research findings into what is actually taking action, what's taking action within the group. And so I think it's an anti-pattern to just outright include your research in your backlog at this point. And I think the reason why that ends up being bad is that just because a customer asks for something in a particular way doesn't mean that's the way you're going to solve it. And that's where I think product managers really come in from a prioritization process standpoint. And then, if it's never changed, it's not really a backlog, right? Like if you're locking yourself into a set of things, that is bad because you're not using your most current information and you're not using that to now decide what to work on. So that's it for backlog. I think I want to just talk really, let's talk now about like what does it mean to do alignment, right? And when I talk about alignment, I think about that there's these three levels that we just talked about: strategy, roadmap, and backlog. There's something key about them being aligned, right? If we go back to what Richard Rummel was talking about, is that he really meant that we have to link from this top level challenge to the coherent actions that we do, and the guiding policy is part of that. But I think you can, when we talk about it in the parlance of product management, what we're really saying is that strategy, roadmap, and backlog need to be in line. And what I mean, again, strategy is timeless and forever. We have our roadmap, which is the foreseeable future. And I guess what I'd say when I use the word foreseeable, I mean one that is more certain than not. And then finally, what we're actually doing this sprint or this block of work, like how are we focusing on this big problem, right? And so, I think there's a few anti-patterns I've seen when it comes to aligning these three things. And so one of them is really mistaking status emails as alignment, right? And so I think, just because you go and send out a bunch of information, it doesn't mean that you're actually building alignment within the team. And this is actually really the only anti-pattern I've seen around alignment. I think, there's probably a lot of bad ways to do alignment, like just, again, assuming status is alignment. But in the end, like, you should be asking it and again, I want to talk about what the tempo is and things like that. But in the end, like, I think alignment from the standpoint of how are you making sure all of your pieces of your organization are working together towards the same goal is highly valuable. And in the end, doesn't actually cause many problems, right? So let's talk about realignment and tempo around this, because I think that's what we're really trying to get to. And I'll try to save some time for some questions. But this is a really great post by Brandon Chu. It was from a while ago. But his first rule is really to be the broken record around strategy. And so what we mean by this is that you should have in your head, even if your strategy is not published somewhere, you should have in your head the 1 or 2 sentence overview of that challenge and reason why we're here to solve it. Because when you're having a discussion, you should be referencing it all the time. You should, anytime that someone comes up to you and asks you for some help on a decision, for example, you should frame it by like, okay, well, so if what we're really trying to do is we're trying to solve X by way of Y, what does that mean for this decision, right? You should be framing things like that almost every single time that you bring that up. And that's why it's important for you to really internalize the strategy. The next thing is that you should make it a part of every planning and review meeting. And so what I mean by that is that, planning meetings are really meant to be that time, in my opinion, where you generate your work items for the sprint. And that's because you're freshest around the knowledge that you need to be able to take action. And during that planning meeting, it's really about the idea of how do you now, based on the, reiterating the strategy, okay, so we're all here to solve X through Y. Here are the next couple roadmap items that we've decided to work on now, making sure everybody agrees to that still. And then finally, the backlog should then, if you generate it from that perspective, it will be as aligned as possible with that. And so what I mean by that is that one of the things I'll do during planning meetings is I'll actually have people, basically, we'll take 5 minutes and we'll say, based on, here's the overview of what we're trying to solve, which is the strategy. Here's the 3 themes that we're still going after, the 3 kind of sub problems we're going after. I want everybody to now privately ideate, which means silently and on their own. I want them to create all of the work items. And sometimes I'll just put this directly in Trello. Sometimes we'll do it on Post-it notes. It depends on the team. I want you to create all of the work items that we need to do to solve this. And so we create all those work items. And then if you have work items that are from a previous sprint, for example, that's the moment that we then do reprioritization. And we do that in the meeting together. And basically what you leave this planning meeting with is you leave this planning meeting with a list of the things to do for that next sprint. In our case, it was a week. But it could be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It depends on how you're running your team, where basically you now have the most alignment as possible with your strategy, roadmap, and backlog that you have working on right now for that deep work. And then what you do when going into the review meeting, you're actually using that review meeting as a place to now say, again, here's what we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve X through Y. And here are the 3 sub problems we felt we were going to try to solve this week. How did we do, right? Did we build something and then now when we look at it, we're like, actually, this doesn't solve the problem the way we thought? Or did we learn something that then invalidates maybe the 3 things that we should be working on? And then in maybe the craziest case is like, does this invalidate something that the strategy needs to take into account? And that should be incredibly rare, but it does happen. So I think that's a great way to look through this like planning and review meeting. And then whenever you detect drift, this is a great time to have these conversations, right? Just in general, to reiterate the strategy, to reiterate the roadmap, and maybe even looking at the backlog randomly. But it's like the main way that I've found to really detect drift is that every now and then, and I mean that like maybe every sprint or 2, I believe heavily in the idea of like one-on-ones between the product person and almost every teammate. It doesn't have to be official, like it doesn't have to be on the calendar, but you should be seeking out time to kind of just say like, how are things going? And then I think the really key question is, do you know how your work connects to the strategy? And I think this is really, really interesting. You should not prompt them again with the strategy in this case, but I think what you'll start to find is you'll start to see, people will if they start to give you a myriad of answers in how the strategy actually works, or if they don't know how their current work actually connects to the strategy, that means that there's a problem potentially. And this is not a quantitative way to do this. I think there are potential quantitative ways using things like the language that people use, things like that. But I found the simplest way to do this possible is really around just asking someone, do you know how this connects to the strategy? And then listen to their answer, and then use that as the ability to learn more. And so that's really realignment, right? Realignment is one of these things you should be doing all the time. I think there's different types of realignment at different levels of the product. Yeah. So in closing, right? Strategy is really that one thing that we agree on. The roadmap is really that prioritization of the problems that make up that one thing we agree on. The backlog should always be the latest thinking. And use this maybe as a guide to watch out for these anti-patterns. And then finally, I haven't been able to find an argument against actually aligning your strategy, roadmap, and backlog, and you should be doing it all the time. So thank you. If you want this slide deck, you'll find it here on this link. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. We've got several questions here.
Great.
First, Syed, I will hand the spotlight over to you.
Hi, Chris. So I listed 3 questions, but I have 4 questions now. So the first question is, what's the advantage of a thematic roadmap over a feature-based roadmap?
Yeah, I think we get back to that fact that a feature-based roadmap is is saying that you have a lot of certainty in the future when you really don't, right? Like that you're not going to learn something sometime between now and when you're going to execute that feature that is not going to change your mind. And so I think the problem there is that even though we will all say that the uncertainty is very high for these very future features, everybody else that looks at that roadmap sees it as a commitment. And that's really, really problematic, especially when we should be constantly learning from what we're doing. Now, maybe there's times when this is something you've built out a million times before. Maybe that's when you can actually say, like, I'm going to ship exactly this. And that, from my point of view, like if you're building something that's multiple years, there's always going to be unknown things. Even when we talk about like buildings, when we talk about like bridges, right? Like we start to get to this like huge scale type of stuff. There's always like work that has to happen that's unknown. And so I would just say that that's the issue, is that it's your past self telling your future self what to do, even though it may not know the most information right now.
Thank you. So my second question is, so let's say you developed the thematic roadmap, and then you come back and you find there are more problems to be solved. So how do you adjust the roadmap? Because it's theme-based.
Yeah, that's right. So if there are more problems to be solved, that essentially what you're doing is you're preparing a list of the problems that you think need to be added, maybe even marking things that you think need to be changed. And then you have that discussion with your team again that says basically, I think based on what we learned, it looks like these themes are no longer appropriate, right? Or what we learned about this theme, actually it's 3 themes and we should break them out. And so it's essentially, it's like you're you're trying to keep this small set of things that you're working on, and you're throwing away everything else that doesn't matter. Like I'm extreme when it comes to archiving issues. Like I just don't care. If it doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing right now, I do not want it in this thing that is our mindset right now. So that's how I do that, is that you should be doing that like every, couple month or two, like maybe quarter if it's big, but like you should be realigning these things all the time.
So essentially it's kind of redeveloping the roadmap.
Yeah, that's right. Your roadmap is not static. If it's static, it's not good then, I think. Yeah, that's an anti-pattern.
Thank you. 2 more questions. So, one of the things you mentioned, and I'm going to read off because I listed the question here, that, not every item or thought should be in the backlog. So if you gain some knowledge or feedback from your stakeholders or customers, and you don't want to store it in as part of the backlog, do you store it in Confluence? And if you do, then how do you create transparency amongst your team members and your stakeholders?
I mean, I think the truth is that Confluence is kind of the dumping ground for information anyways. So I would say, sure, put it there. But what I would do is I would probably utilize individual people's spaces. Like if people want to keep an idea log, like a journal of ideas that they have, I think that's perfectly acceptable. It's just that they should be using that when we get into the planning meeting to generate work, or in the roadmap meeting to talk about what are the problems we're trying to solve. It should not be that it's it's not the product person's job to manage everybody else's ideas. That's just like my statement there. So if someone tries to put an idea into my backlog or roadmap, I'm just like, that's interesting, but we're not working on it right now. So if you want to store it somewhere, and frankly, it's up to you to decide how you want to store it. Let's bring it up when it's appropriate, right? But right now, it's all it's going to do is it's going to create overhead for the entire team. And one more question.
You're muted. Say it.
Sorry. Can I? Okay. So the last question in your last slide, you were referring to the backlog as latest thinking. I didn't fully understand that concept.
Yeah.
You mind elaborating?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I mean by the backlog being the latest thinking is it's like the things that we really think are most important to do right now, right? Like it's everything that should be in the backlog right now, like that list of to do, it should be based on everything that you know at that moment. In the entire team. And I guess it's just, I'm kind of trying to tie the fact that it's not only just, it's based on the most current research, it's based on your most current decisions, and it's based on the fact that this is what you need to be doing right this moment. And so from my perspective, that's like the latest thinking within the team. And that's kind of the short answer to that.
Yeah, thank you.
We've also got a question from Yogesh.
Hey.
You're muted, Yogesh. Yep.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for talking about this road mapping.
Yeah.
So I would like to talk about the fact that you were talking about the unknown things and the roadmap. And one of my findings over the years is that unknown things are generally, we have very little idea or have zero knowledge about it when we just doing a road mapping. So how do you keep, how do you put them in the roadmap basically, because we have zero idea about the amount of effort required, what are the different unknowns, and what is the relevance on that? So how do you take care of those things?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on the team and the stage of the team, but if a team is just getting started, usually that roadmap is actually questions that they have just about their customers, right? So I would say it's not so much about problems in that case, but it's basically just a list of questions, right? And so I've definitely coached people where they're just getting started. And so it just lists your questions and lists your assumptions about them, and then go off and do the research, right? And that's really at that stage. For things where it's a later stage company, they have a lot of other things they're working on, it basically becomes somewhere between like a research sprint and a spiking sprint, right? Because usually there's both technical and understanding things about that customer that you need to do. Like, what are the ways that other people solve this? How could we solve this technically within our organization? But also, like, what are these people actually are considering as a solution? What is the real problem that they understand, right? So I think of those things like the theme can still just be a regular problem like everything else in that list. It's just that it's something you actually have zero knowledge about. I would still put down what your assumptions are because you always want to be checking and calibrating yourself, but that's really what it is.
Cool. We've got the last question now from John. If we could do this somewhat accelerated, would be appreciated.
Okay, I'll ask really quick. And apologies in advance, Chris. I'm going to put you on the spot here. One of the things I've noticed in doing the mentoring is that I sort of I project this image of how things should be, and it's probably not always the case in my. So just as out of interest, in your current backlog and your current roadmap, like how many items are in there? Just I'm testing you basically.
No, and you know what? Here's the thing: is that the organization that I'm in right now, my role is not to manage the backlog, and so it is not the way that I would want it to be. Let's just put it that way. But in my previous role, like I'd say the design consultancy was the time where we were probably near the last year of projects where we had the highest alignment with this type of strategy. Now, what's most important though is you should also be retroing every sprint, right? And so having these exact setup the way that I like to have it, it doesn't always turn out exactly that way. And that's because the team doesn't need it that way, right? So that's what I would say. I'm fairly new into my org as well, so I'm only 6 months in. And maybe this goes back to another rule I have about product management, is that when you're a new product manager or a leader as a product manager, your job is to learn, not to do. And so in this particular case, it's more about trying to understand the organization rather than trying to change it in some massive way right now. So that's the other thing I'd say. So I'm trying not to make excuses, but I totally agree with you. I totally.
It was an unfair question, but just
no, it's a fair question, absolutely. And the reason why it's a fair question is that I definitely want us to get to that point, and I'm doing things to get us to that point. But it's not something that you can change overnight with any organization. So what I'd say is like pick a piece of this and try it as an experiment within your organization and see if it works for you, and keep trying to do that type of thing, right? Like that's what I would say.
No, great. Yeah, I love the idea of it. I mean, definitely. I'm going to try some of these things, but yeah,
cool.
My backlog is way too big at the moment.
I would love to hear how it works out and if I can help with that. So
that's great.
Thanks.
Awesome. Give me one moment here. Awesome. So thanks, Chris, for the talk on alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog. As always, the presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel. Big thank you from me, Nis Frome, today's moderator, and to everyone who joined us today as part of the Product Mentor. Don't forget, if you're interested in joining the Product Mentor as a mentor, like Chris, you can join theproductmentor.com. If you'd like to post a job or looking for a job as a product person, visit theproductjobs.com. Thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy your day. We do actually have another talk right now from Brian that we'll get started in. Oh no, from Patrick. Patrick's giving a talk now. Patrick, are you on? No. Let's see. Sorry about that, Brian. Didn't mean to scare you there.
It just scared me a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know why I thought he said Brian. Said Patrick. Cool. Is Patrick on? Thanks, Chris, for the talk. That was great.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Got more questions we didn't even get to, but you can check them out in the chat.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I mean, if we have time, I'm happy to answer more questions.
Yeah, go for it. We had a question from Brian.
Yeah, where'd I put my question? I was curious if you had any tips or techniques on this. So it's easy to get caught up in focusing on solutions instead of taking a step back to align to problems. Like we're doing the work every day to make sure, we're building the right things. So we end up focusing on the solutions.
Yep.
Like, do you have any tips or techniques on staying grounded to take a step back and think about the problems? Or like I think you had mentioned like you write down your strategy. One of the slides was write it down. So I'm just like, are you sticky notes all over the place, or are you like, just trying to be present all the time? Like, what do you do to help yourself stay grounded?
I mean, I think one of the things is I always ask like why. I mean, I know it's like a very simple technique, but like the idea of 5 whys from Six Sigma or like why laddering, things like that, I think is really helpful because like. And also maybe I'm just a natural skeptic in general. So anytime I see some work about to be done, I'm like, why does this work need to be done? Does it actually? Like, I'm trying not to do something around like being a lazy product manager, but I think that might be like my final book title is The Lazy Product Manager. And it's just like, if we shouldn't just do work all the time, right? We should really be taking a step back. And I think it takes kind of breaking down these biases of action orientation, which is good in a lot of ways. But you as a product person, you need to be trying to take a step out of why you're, and ask that question of why. So I'd say like, as much as you can, just in your mind, whenever there's a question about whether you should do something or not, it's like, why would this be meaningful? And then having that strategy written down somewhere can be very helpful because then, again, if you have it in your head, you're like, well, this doesn't make sense or it doesn't jibe and connect with this in any way. That could be problematic still. Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hey, I just threw another question in there.
Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Great. I was just wondering if you had any tips for setting a strategy that's timeless. I found that super challenging. Yeah,
when I say timeless, it means that you shouldn't be talking about a future state of the world, right? Like one of the key things there is that I can't remember who actually said it, but it's that you should deal with the world the way it is today rather than the future. And so now there's some interesting things around trend analysis and speculation and bets, right? But the truth is that when we talk about strategy again, it's not about the idea that we're going to do something in the future. It's about how do we make a decision today towards our strategy. So I don't know, like some of the things that I would say you should be looking at, like it doesn't mean that you can't have evidence of like say around trends, right? But like, what do you need to get done today that you would need to make decisions around. And that's what I mean by timeless. So if you hear words about like in the future we'll do this, or in the future, you know, the problem that we're trying to solve is this future problem, I think that's actually kind of part of the problem, right? Like you should be solving problems today. It's just that it's not the same problems all the time. Like, for example, when you talk about the way that, say, you know, Amazon does things, I could imagine that they want to eventually go into services that just ship stuff to your place, right? Like they don't even ask you, they just kind of ship what they think you need at a certain point, right? Now, the strategy that they have today is that they're trying to do their best to not only be like constantly maximizing, well, yeah, Jeff Bezos is an interesting character too, because like, you know, he's talked about the fact that you should always focus on what is going to be true about the future rather than you know, what's never going to change, right? So he talks about it from the standpoint of like that people always want more things faster and cheaper, right? And so using that as kind of a mindset to then apply to all of your problems, that's kind of timeless, right? It's not just about the future, it's about the fact that we know that people want this today. So how can we make things, like what are the problems we can solve around making things faster, cheaper, or better, right? Or more of them, right? Yeah.
We've got Patrick here.
All right, great.
Jeremy's got us on a tight time.
Yeah,
awesome.
Cool.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
I'm gonna get started right now. Hey everyone, it's Sunday, August 11th, 2019, and this is the Product Mentor talk. Today we're joined by Patrick Hoffman, who will be speaking about the rule of 7, how to structure your product organization to succeed. Allow me to briefly explain the format. So the Product Mentor program was started several years ago, matches product leaders and seasoned product professionals with those earlier in their career, product managers, aspiring product managers, for mentorship and guidance. We're joined by a number of folks in the active session, both mentors and mentees. If everyone could just wave really quickly. Cool. You see them all here. We're going to go around the room for brief introductions. If everyone could state their name, location, role, and whether they're a mentor or mentee, that'd be great. Let's start with Brian.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Postelnick. I'm a product mentor in this program. I've been a product manager for 6 years. I'm currently a product manager at Angie's List. I'm based in Indianapolis, Indiana.
And Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Berry. I'm a product manager in London for a company called LexisNexis, and I'm a mentee.
Awesome. And Chris.
Yep, I'm Chris Butler. I'm Chief Product Architect at IPsoft, and I'm based out of New York, and I'm a mentor.
And Daniel.
I'm Daniel Ponsinghi, based in Toronto, mentee, and work at a company called Modo Insight.
Awesome. Fabiola.
Hi there, I'm Fabiola, originally from Chile, but living and based in Mexico City. So I'm a mentee, but I work as a head of product of a startup called Runa HR, which is a payroll as payroll, and also human resources software.
Awesome. John.
Hi everyone, I'm John Masterson and I am the Chief Product Officer at ImproveWell. We are a workforce engagement platform based in London, and I am a mentor in this program.
Marvin.
Hey everyone, my name is Marvin Matthew. I'm based in New York City, and I'm the head of product at a cryptocurrency trading platform called Bitsian, and I'm a product mentee.
Nicola.
Hey, I'm Nicola. I'm based in Copenhagen. I'm product manager in a company called 2021 AI, and I'm a mentee.
Patrick.
Hey everyone, so my name is Patrick Hoffman. I'm a mentor based in the Bay Area, so San Francisco. And I work at a company called Udacity. I head up product for our enterprise division.
Awesome. Vivek.
Hi everyone, I'm from Bangalore, Vivek, PM in Recipe. I'm a mentee in this program.
Yogesh.
Hi guys, I'm Yogesh. I'm a product mentor. I'm based in New York City and I work as a senior product manager in the company called the Omnicom Health Group.
And Candice.
Hi, I'm Candice Zhang. I'm a mentee in this program. So I'm based in New Jersey and I'm a head of product of a company called 10-4.
Awesome. Just as a reminder, please post your questions to the Q&A section at theproductmentor.com/live. As the questions come in, I will jump in and pass them over to Patrick during the talk. I am Nis Frome. I am the one of the mentor leads for the program and your moderator for today's live stream. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Patrick.
Thanks, Nis. So today's talk, I'm going to be kind of diving into some different ways to think about product organization and about product teams within the larger organization of a company. So the focus is going to be a bit around the core activities that product teams go through, but also how those change and evolve over time during the life of a company, the life of a product. So as I mentioned during the check-in part, my name is Patrick Hoffman. I head up product over at Udacity for Enterprise. So Udacity is an online training and technology company. Our mission is to really help people power their careers through learning technology, and in my case, help companies actually power that by getting them to be more efficient with their training, upskilling, etc. So really care about experiences and, again, making great experiences for my customers. So in terms of the rule of 7, think about how you structure any product organization. I think, as with many product decisions, it's really key to step back and actually think about the context first, which is your business, right? You need to understand your business, your product, and your teams. And so you want to think about that in kind of 2 ways. One, where you are today, as well as where you're going to be in the future. These are just some questions that you might ask yourself. For instance, like, what's the stage of the business? For those who haven't been exposed to maybe different readings on this or different thoughts, most businesses go through different stages, right? Amazon today is not the same Amazon as 1994, 1995. Who are the customers you're serving today, right? Again, the customers that Amazon is serving today are quite different than those they started serving when it was just a book delivery service. And then what types of products are you producing today? Again, over time, if you're successful, you'll start adding more products to the market. If you're not successful, you're going to be trying to get your products to fit the market. And then you want to think about what are the customers wanting you to do today that maybe you weren't already doing. And then most importantly, what's the team? What is it that you are able to do with the team that you have? And again, like, basically the same questions in the future. And this is really important as it comes to your product organization. As you look at where are we today, where we want to go, and is my team, is my organization, is that everything set up to actually help me get to that spot? And if it's not, you're going to want to be making adjustments as you go, right? So then after answering these questions, that can be your North Star, saying this is where we should be heading. And that helps you then backfill into how you're going to recruit people, how are you going to hire people, how are you going to organize and scale your teams so that they can be successful at this stage, but also say you get the wonderful thing that enterprise SaaS companies target, right? Which is triple, triple, double, double, double. Like, with that kind of growth, in the span of a year, you might go from where half your organization is product and R&D to where less than 20% of your organization is product and R&D, and most of your organization is sales and marketing and that online growth part of the company. And when that happens, your role as product shifts a lot, right? Your communication has to improve a lot. How you enable your sales team has to change and improve. And so you should keep that in mind when thinking about where you are today. And as part of that, there are some frameworks that can help, such as the Crossing the Chasm framework from Jeffrey Moore, really classical one. Pretty much, if you're not aware of it, like, as a PM, go dive deep, figure out more about it. There's always going to be chasms in a product and in a company. Part of this ties back to product market fit, but also, and this is something that's coming out more and more, once you have product market fit, do you actually have go-to-market fit? Do you have the ability to really take it out and scale? And so those are things to be aware of, and there's other talks that we've done here at the Product Mentor Group that touch on those different points and how to understand when you have them and when you don't have them. Other ones that can help is to think about it in terms of an organism or a population, right? And so in many ways, people might look at the past behavior, the past performance of a team, of a company, of a product group, and try and forward project. And you can always see those lovely hockey stick curves that companies will do as they're trying to raise funding or make a case to the market that they're really worth adopting and worth investing in. But like most populations, where things come up like survival of the fittest, et cetera. It's a case of where's your business, where's your product today, what are the characteristics, traits it has today, and what's the market condition, right? And so it's really important when looking at your forward prospects of understanding, okay, not just where are we today, where have we come from, right? Have we been doing this crazy growth? But what's the market going to be like a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now? And that includes your customers, but also your vendors, your providers, technological trends underneath, right? For instance, things that you maybe would have spent 4 years building today, or sorry, building in the past. Now, thanks to technology like Docker and others, you can probably get that spun up in less than a month and maybe even a weekend. And because of that, that means that there's more and more competitors that could just come in and come into your market. And so that then influences and should be influencing how you think about your product and about your team that's going after making that product be viable in the super long term. Which ties back then also to, as a product manager, and particularly as you scale up in your career as a product manager, you want to be cognizant of investment horizons. So like, remember, like your job as product is both to like really make something delightful and valuable to customers, but you're doing that in order to bring money into your business, right? Like you are there to serve your business, to make it viable so that in the long term, it continues to exist, continues to be able to provide that value to your customers. And it's important then to be able to think not only of, okay, if I start building this feature set, or if I'm going after this completely greenfield new product, what's the return curve, right? So is it going to be something that I'm working on and I expect to derive value from it in less than the next 6 months? Or is it something that it's going to take a while to invest into? Say, for instance, if it's a new type of hardware, or going after a really hard challenge in machine learning, and it's something that I won't get to actually realize revenue in the case of like bringing value to your customers for years, right? And if you're starting off early as a company, you probably, depending on where you are and depending on your funding and your viability and also your team, you may not want to go after a problem that's going to be 5 years to the point where you just first get to start having customers come in the door, right? You're going to try and scale that back. Instead of going after the car, maybe you go after a scooter, something that's a bit simpler and solves part of the same problem. So thinking about that, right, and thinking about the different stages that you go through, it's often really good to think of it in terms of growth. And so here Slack is one of those examples, right? And so bottom right is that reference to, in SaaS growth, you really want to have that triple, double scenario going on. Like that's your target in the first 5 years. You just gotta grow. You've got to get that massive momentum in order to be able to deal with all the debt that you're going to potentially be accruing as a new business or a new product unit that's coming out, right? In those first 5 years, you're going to potentially take shortcuts. You're trying to get that market fit. And because of that, you have to get that growth in order to be able to pay down that debt later. And an interesting thing, right? So like Slack is held up as a perfect example of that. But if you look at that far right one and you go into that snapshot, right? So that snapshot is the same period, right? And it's when Slack was first starting. And on one scale, and this is kind of the trick with data, you don't want to lie to yourself, even if you're presenting things in a very optimum light for investors and others. They made it look like a hockey stick type scenario happening, and that even after a drop, they're recovering. The reality is when you look at that longer trend, it's actually quite flat. And in graphics today that they've done, now that they're actually viable 6 years later, they leave that as being actually the very flat part of the curve. And so your business and your product team at that stage needs to operate very differently than the product team for where Slack is now, right? So you may get into doing fake door tests and other experiments to validate what parts of your product to invest in, what parts of your business to invest in, and what markets to go after. You'll end up doing as much user experience interviewing and things like that at that point, but you'll probably interpret some of those signals differently, right? You're going after different markets. So early Slack, bottoms up, come at the team level and in. Slack today, they still have that. It's very core, but they also have opened up a lot of enterprise side for coming in top down and into a business, having integrations, having channel sales partners, doing things with Microsoft. All of that are things that Slack and the product team today do that really Slack and the product team back in 2014, 2015, they wouldn't be doing. And so a similar point looking at, say, Uber, right? They just went IPO last year. And depending on what you look at in your data, right? Are you looking at the total value, the total revenue coming in? That's one important metric. But another one that CEOs often think about is what's your growth rate? And this gets back to that factor earlier about the doubling and the tripling, right? And so tripling is technically its higher growth rate percentage. Like you're going, let's say 300% and then 200%. So 200% growth next to 300% growth looks like you're shrinking. But the reality is if you're continuing, if that base number is larger, you're still getting significant growth. And so try to be aware of the data when you're looking at it, when you're looking at your past data, but also understand that as this happens, right, this can result in existential crises inside of businesses, right? If the growth rate starts to flatten, you're no longer telling the story to the market, to your investors, that perhaps your board and your executives team wants you to be telling them. And so that's going to have a very big impact on you as a product manager and how you approach products where you choose to invest. And maybe this is particular to technology companies, but in many ways this applies to every company, right? If you go and look at the latest AT&T earnings call, like you can see that they're also dealing with some of this growth and people saying, they're not getting the growth that we're expecting. These other areas are shrinking too rapidly. And all of this fits into how you approach product, where you as a large product team choose to invest, but also you as an individual IC, how are you handling the work? Is the thing that you're working on even going to ship and bring value? And how you think about that is key. How you work with other teams becomes key, because these are signals that really run through the whole company as you're building product. Which ties back then to, and this maybe is less applicable to folks when you're like a mid-level IC or a senior IC, but once you flip over or once you're able to start really informing your organization, it's really key to have organizing philosophies. But as I'll touch on later, it's also really important not to fall into a trap here, right? And so you want to understand that things that work in one place may not in another. So I'll touch on that later as well. But there's basically like at times two ways of coming at this, right? You can come at it from start with a customer, start with your market, start with like, where are we, right? So given this marketplace, given these market conditions, given these people that we're trying to target, what is the thing that we should create, right? So if you were like, say, walk down to a park, you'd have to, and you want to choose what animal am I going to build, you would look at, okay, what's going on? What is the thing that I can add to this ecosystem that will be successful in it, right? And so a really simple framework that can help with pieces of that, and this is like high level, right, is to think about what's existing and what's new. And in this case, it's both you, your company, and your products, but also your markets, your customers, right? And when you do that, you end up with basically 4 buckets into which you as a product team, you as a product group can fall. And the reality is you can fall into more than one, right, depending on what you're focusing on. And when you're in each of those buckets, you're going to have a different approach to product. You're going to have a different kind of energy driving you, right? And so growth factors in a bit, delighting the customers factor in a bit, but the challenges that you and your product team will face in, say, an area of product diversification are far different than those in market penetration, right? Your need to do really deep user research and design research may be significantly more of an investment in that product diversification time than in the market penetration, where you really focus on how you optimize that repeatable sales motion and making sure that you're getting in front of the right customers and giving them more of the right product, right? And so that's just a framework to leave with you when you think about where's your product today and where's your company and your customers today. Another one is to perhaps start from a really, what people talk about as a trusted model, right? Over the last, decade at least, there's been tons of different books published, how Google works, presentations given by people like the CPO over at Box about what's the ideal method to organize, right? And of late, there's at least been a shift to like some people saying that there's an ideal model, right? And they talk about like pods and P-pods and things like that. And so I'm just going to like walk you through one potential example of what might be an idealized org, and mostly walk thinking of other product people you work with, and therefore informing how they look at an organization. So if your company happens to go through a growth decline and you need to reorganize, or you start scaling rapidly and you need to just double down, this may be underpinning how other product people or other leaders are looking at your team, your organization. And you want to be wary, right? Like going back to that point before, you want to make sure that you're actually structuring it for your market, for your customers, and for your business, both where it is today and where you want to be in the future. You don't want to just take a framework off the shelf and say, okay, we're applying this to this company. You want to make sure that what you're applying actually fits and works with your company, your customers, and the market. And so, you know, this is kind of one of the ideas of why you go after this. So PPODs is basically product management, engineering, analytics, which think of like business insights, program management. You know, those folks keep the trains going on time. And in some companies, the first P and the second P get bound together. But then your growth, so like online growth is a huge thing today, right? Like 10 years ago, maybe we'd be talking more about like hitting the ground, boots, out of home type selling. But really today, almost every product, you're going to have an online growth component where people are doing digital marketing, people are doing sales, where we're hopping on Zoom and I'm doing a sales call from that. D for design, and then, you know, S for that support, right? And part of this factors into like your customer and the market, like it's huge. And you as a product manager, you'll get like the snap of it, right? You'll work with other teams to try and understand, but end of the day, like you're dealing with this massive thing, say it's an elephant, and you may only get one piece of it. And all of these other teams are getting so many other pieces of this puzzle that you as a PM, by like helping bridge between them, when you do that, you really start painting that picture of the customer, painting that picture of the market, and therefore understanding their needs and what you should be building into. And so, you know, product management, as I mentioned, right, you're like at the nexus, right? And so some of those groups mentioned earlier, they're on one side, right? They're tied more to that R&D. Like, what is it that we should be building it? What is it that we are now building? And then the other side is really, okay, great, we've built something. We've built something that we want to bring to market. How do we go about distributing it? How do we go about making sure that our team is best positioned to distribute it? How we market it, how we talk about it, how we educate customers, but also how we serve those customers so that they keep coming back, so that they trust us to buy more. And so like that is key for you as that product manager to set that vision, to work with your product management team to set that vision, and then to bridge between those two areas. And, you know, early in your career, maybe you're only on one half of that puzzle. Maybe you're at the R&D side, or maybe you're on the growth side. You're a product manager who's helping serve your marketing and sales team, giving them tooling, helping make them more efficient, helping educate them about what the pitch is. But over time, as you level up in your career, you're going to definitely be bridging both of those and needing to be aware of how to work with teams in both of those areas. Engineering, of course, you know, those are the folks developing, building it. Analytics, you know, if you can be aware of it as a PM, how to use it, how to pick up, you know, SQL, do some data analysis. But if not, you need to know how to work with people who are in the analytics teams, how to basically ask them a question in a way that they can go to your data and they can run a query that will produce an answer to that question that you can use to then inform your business. And you want to be asking these people as well to weigh in, right? They're looking at the data all day. You may not be. Program management, again, like really the kind of the folks that keep the trains running on time. In much smaller organizations, you as the product manager will likely be doing this, right? You may be doing a couple of these other roles too, depending on the size and the stage of your business or your team, right? You could be a small carved off team in a larger business. You haven't hired design yet, so you as the PM have to be doing wireframes and figuring out what's the right flow, what's the right structure, doing that user research that you might depend on designers to do. And so similarly, right, like when I first got to Udacity in enterprise, we had a marketing team for a bit, and then due to the change in direction on enterprise, that marketing team left, and suddenly I, as the PM, I was responsible for our marketing. I was responsible for making sure that our ad campaigns were structured in the right way, that our copywriting was being done in the right way to communicate our product, but also that we were leveraging these wonderful new tools of digital marketing to get signal from the market. What is the right way to talk about this? What is, you know, the right imagery to use? What are the right products that we're building, right? If I put two things out, which one's going to get more attention from the market and help my sales team close deals? And so you as a PM, definitely like over time, you may shift towards one or another of these areas, but having broad exposure, awareness, and ability to operate in these areas is really key to your growth. And I'll touch on that part later too. And again, so design, like I mentioned, it's both existing products, how you're improving them, but also going after the new products, which gets into, you know, user research cuts through, but ideation, these new ones, design fits into it, both system level, but also application level. And so like design is a really a key part, right? So product design engineering, your classical conception of what product is, but really product is bridging all the way through. And then support is one that if you end up reading some of the articles or the books or hearing people talk about it, it often gets left behind, right? Or they bundle it in with growth. And pieces of it can, right? Success is a means of making your customers like really happy with your product, really want to come back and get the best use out of it. But it also touches into things like warranties, SLAs, and other things that maybe aren't as often associated with that. And you as a product manager, and particularly like in, say, a company under even 75 people, right? You as a PM will often be responsible for coming in and informing people about how you should be structuring warranties for your product, what types of SLAs you can be going after, and working with your engineering team and other operational teams to really structure that out and make it a reality, and then bundle that as part of your product, make that a selling proposition for your product to your customers. And so like, it's good to have like those frameworks, right? So you've got like the organism model and like, what is it to survive in this ecosystem? You have, okay, if we just had the ideal system, we're going to do this and drop it down, and no matter what, potentially we win, that's good and all. But then how do you structure your product org, right? And this is one where, maybe open up to the audience a bit more as you guys should be thinking about it. And that's like, if you were to look at this example, right? And we'll take a few minutes here, like think about, why would this team be structured in this way, right? So why is analytics and the design team, why are those reporting into product? And why is the product team structured at a feature level, right? At a surface area, which is saying, like if you were Uber, for instance, maybe there's a feature lead that's dealing with the algorithm that's serving the matching. And there's a feature lead that's dealing with the mobile application. There's a feature lead dealing with promotions. And there's a feature lead dealing with the rider behavior, et cetera, right? All the way down, right? Just like each thing, instead of you being holistic, covering the whole product, you're covering a very narrow surface area. And then why is the engineering like similarly matched up to where there's groups that are kind of serving into the feature leads, but at times bridging over? And why is growth only going into certain engineering groups? So that's a question, right? And it's possible that it's bound to the stage of the company. It's possible it's bound to the type of team in place, right? So the reasons that analytics and design might be reporting into product, it could be that either the business is young at a certain stage and therefore they don't have those types of leaders, or it could be that it's big and it's mature, and again, they just don't have those leaders. And so the product person, they have those deep T's in data and design, and so they are helping run those teams. They're helping set the vision for not just product, but for design and for the data teams. And so, we'll look at some other examples going on, but keep that in mind when you're looking at your own product organization, your own company organization, right? And ask yourself, like, why is it structured this way? Often it's going to be bound to the people you have, the trust that those people have with, higher up in the organization, but also across adjacent organizations, right? And so that's really something key to think about. And another thing here, like that you're seeing potentially, is that growth is divorced from analytics and design, right? So if growth wants to get information about analytics, or if growth wants to get design done, they actually have to like ladder up, head over to the product lead, and only from then are they going to get served by analytics and design, right? So like, what are the dysfunctions, or what are the functional improvements that maybe result from that kind of Chinese wall existing between, and growth having to navigate and hit those other teams in that way, right? And growth in this area, think about marketers, for instance, and the different types of marketers perhaps that you've worked with, those that maybe think very intentionally and can forecast out, and those that are just trying to get the next greatest thing shipped as fast as possible, right? And think about those dynamics between those teams, right? Think about the people you've seen in design and in analytics, and how those personalities may mix or not mix with other types of those personalities. And so this other example kind of touches on more of that classical pod structure, right? And so you've got like your executive team, and they ladder, and they have different groups, right? And so like maybe here there's this horizontal layer. There's a question of, okay, is there an actual chief product officer type role? Potentially there is up in that, but potentially depending on where the business is, maybe they have GMs or VPs of product for these different verticals that are running their groups underneath that. And we'll touch on like how teams of teams kind of help structure out later and what that might look like there. But think about like, why would a company end up structuring itself like this? What stage of business might they be at that this is now kind of their standard way of doing things, where engineering is bound to product it's matrixed into itself, but it's bound to product, where operations are now bound actually to a product area, product line, or perhaps even a geographic product business line, where data again is bound, but matrixed. The design is bound and potentially not matrixed. And then again, support is bound. Like, why would a business start kind of bundling things in that way? What are the efficiencies you gain from that? And also, what are the lack of efficiencies that start happening? And where would that business be going in the future? Something important to think about. And this third example, is somewhat, it's a blend. It comes in from these other ones. These are actually, like, by the way, examples of business organizations I've seen in companies I've worked at and companies I've worked for. So I'm not saying that they're the right way or the best way or even the worst way. They're just a way. And back to that first point, like, it results from their environment, the traits that they have, the people they have. All of these things are informing how they end up organizing, and they may change over time, right? Like this, what we're seeing here may actually evolve into what we saw in example 2, or it may have started from what was example 1. And so in this one, right, it's interesting to look at it because there's potentially this very large area of the business, right, that maybe is bringing in all of the revenue for it. And then they've sliced off another subset, and they said, okay, like, this is an area we're going to invest in. That could be 1, it could be 3, it could be 5, right? It could be a dozen, depending on the size of the business. Maybe, Google is a good example where so much of the revenue comes from their ad space, and yet they keep spinning off these experiments, right? They had shopping and Express, they have the Google Home and the hardware, YouTube, all these other business lines that, end up feeding back into that larger entity, but that larger entity, right, is that, like, really strong growth engine. And in that, like, how that growth, how that team driving it may end up actually driving the product. And Google probably isn't a good example of that one, but there are businesses where instead of product being adjacent to marketing growth, actually product reports into growth. And the growth team is helping set what are the types of products we want to go after, like, what are the categories we want to play in, what are the markets we want to play in, and then product is helping serve to that of how to best play in that market, how to play in that category, but also informing growth so they can make the right bets, right? And then product at that point, like, they're bridging to growth, but they're really bound to and dealing with all of these things down funnel of the engineering. And the other thing here to note is that, like, data, it's no longer potted off, right? It's a team of data. So you might be landing requests in. So how does that impact life for you as a product manager? How does that impact, like, the way your team operates if you no longer have the ability to just land a request and get it served immediately, but you have to put it into a queue? And you have to now understand the performance of that queue, the prioritization of that queue, and when the work request you've landed will actually come back to you. And that applies here again to design, but then also, like, to operations and support, right? So, like, if you raise an issue, if you are getting signal in, maybe it's feeding to your team, maybe it's not feeding right to your team, and you don't find out about it until later that there's been an outage or a negative customer experience, right? Because you're not sitting right next to that support person, you're not bound to them where you can hear what's going on. And so how does that change your approach to product, to how you're building things? And so this is all, like, contextualizing in to get up to, like, this team of teams type thing, right? And there's really, like, there's many ways of thinking about this, but there's 2 dominant philosophies that are kind of taking over. And there's this one, right, which is a very flat organization. And for many new startups, right, early on, they've kind of adopted this model, like, we have to be flat, right? So it's like maybe the CEO and then a whole bunch of people, and under these people, there's as many people as possible, right? We don't want to be bound with management and hierarchies and escalations. We want to have as much information go from layer to layer as fast as possible. And certain companies, have adopted models like this at scale, right? So if you read how Google works, they talk about how they don't want to have fewer than 7 direct reports coming to somebody, right? They want to have far more than 7. And on this next slide, we'll kind of talk through maybe why that is. And so in this next one, right, and this is one I've actually seen done at other companies, it's a very different structure, and it's saying, actually, like, we're going to cap it and say, we don't want you to have any more than 5 or 6 direct reports. And so you end up with a very vertically deep organization, a lot of hierarchy going on, a lot of potentially, as you get down to a layer, you'll now have one manager with 1 report, which seems a little bit odd, right? That they have to give so much of their time, and it's just 1 report. And why different groups kind of end up on either side of this, right? The first group, may intentionally be trying to structure themselves to minimize the micromanagement that can result from an organizational model like this. It may be that, you know, they're used to that, or they've found it to be successful, right? And there are definitely companies that have run that way. And there are definitely successful companies that have run more in this way, right? Where it's very top down, where what you're going to be working on is defined by the people above you, rather than, okay, given the vision of the company, what are the areas and the initiatives that my team is aware of that we have the skills to go after, the ability to learn skills to go after, and how do we then communicate that upward, right? Like that happens a lot in that first model, whereas this last one is very much like, here's the mandate, and it flows down, right? And it's always flowing down, very hierarchical. And there is also, like, of course, a blend between these. But think about like your product, and if you were to have to be running your team inside of this model versus, say, the other model, what would change? How would it change how you approach the job of product management, how you approach communication, the ease with which you're able to, say, reach across, right? Like maybe in this case, there's even rigid rules where if you're AV, right, you can't really get easy hold of BV. You have to ladder up, escalate to A, who's going to bring it to B and bring it down. What does that do for you as a product manager and how you're working? And this could be both product teams as you grow and scale, but it could be, and really often the case, like product and growth and others, right? So how does that happen? How do silos impact how you end up doing your work, or how do the lack of silos impact how you're doing your work? And then, of course, like both of those really factor into like, and this is one important as well for you as an IC, so an individual contributor, as much as for when you're a manager, right? And that's positioning your people to win. So like, let's say that you're on a hiring panel and you're going out and you're interviewing, you know, dozens of product managers in the last couple of months trying to bring people in. You know, you're not like, you could in some companies just hire to fill the role, like exactly fit, like we know exactly what we want. You could be hiring for generalist types, people that come in and you are then going to work with them to make them successful. And ideally any business, you'd be doing that, right? And this is a key thing then for when you look at these structures as a manager, as a product leader, or as you come into a completely like new business to you, right? Like let's say that you've chosen to go to a new company, the company has been around for 15 years, right? Or 20 years. And the companies you've been at maybe previously were run a different way. And now you come in and you kind of, you know, you map out your organization, you start seeing where the ley lines are, where the connections are, and you start seeing how this organization operates. How do you now make yourself successful in there so that you can achieve what you want? But also if you're coming in as a leader, right, managing other people, how do you look at this and understand whether it's working, whether it's not working, and how to help drive that change management, right? How do you help move the company and the team to be where it needs to be for you to hit your objectives as a product leader? And so I'm not going to go deep on that now, but there's tons to go and read up on how to do that and how to structure the relationships, manager to IC, but also manager to manager, and empowering your people that are reporting into you to really be successful. But you know, beyond that, like the next stage is then thinking about scaling, right? And this is an important thing both for yourself as you scale yourself in your career, and the fact that you can go up and down, right? There's plenty of people I've seen who have scaled up, become a director, and then perhaps they've switched to another business and they've scaled back, right, to a senior product manager. They're a principal PM. They're going and becoming an IC again to get to know their new space and then scale up within that organization, within that space. But also then how do you scale your teams, right? If you're going to go after a new company, a new business, or even a new product line, right, you're going to experience many of the same challenges, right? Which is you may get rocket ship growth, you may get growth that takes you to a bit and then flat lines, you may be flat. So, and then get growth. And so it's important to understand, like, as you're scaling, and it gets back to that first model of the ecosystem, right? If you're taking your past behavior and predicting that forward, you may start scaling or structuring or hiring your team in a certain way. And should the way you've scaled not actually meet that reality of what's going on, you need to be really agile and adept at looking at it and questioning what you've done and perhaps scaling back down or just delaying the pace at which you're scaling, right? And so for yourself, right, this is a potential model. You know, if you go and look up many of the companies out there, Those with more formalized matrices and structures, they may have an actual path, right? So you could even come in as an IC0, like an associate PM, and then over time you're scaling up, and eventually like you're a staff product manager or a principal product manager, but you're that lead, right? You're not necessarily managing people at an HR level, negotiating salaries and dealing with retention and all of that, but you are making sure that your teams are optimized, that you are delivering and reaching the goals that your leaders have been setting, that you yourself are setting. And then there may or may not be an amount of overlap, right, between these two levels as far as like how they're perceived within the company. And that's when you flip to say more of a manager side. And as you scale from manager, right, you may end up over time, actually, that far end is you're now a manager of managers, right? And what does that look like when you are now managing, say group PMs or directors of product who have many people underneath them? And how does that influence how you approach product then? How you help those people at your level, but also skip leveling down? How do you make them successful? How do you kind of state the vision for not just your product, but how you're going to organize your product, how you're going to make people want to really be working with you and at your company to go after the market problem that you're going for, so you can actually make those customers happy. And like similarly then, think about scaling your product organization, right? So if you're a 10-person startup, right, maybe there's like 1 PM and maybe you're doing design a bunch of things. Then you scale, maybe you've gone to 100 people, right? And now you've started having maybe different functional areas, and you're running, potentially reporting in B and C reporting data, potentially running parallel, right? And just working as kind of one mind pod. And then scale that up, right? Now you're going to be 1,000 people, or say you're 10,000. Say you're like one of those really wildly successful businesses. Maybe you're 30 years old now, something like an Adobe or a Cisco, et cetera. And then how do you structure yourself there? And how do you as a business leader within your company, how do you think about where you are today and how to keep moving yourself to there, right? And whether or not you need to shift back, right? So if you spent time looking at the news or anything else, like you'll see Uber, for instance, just got rid of 400 people from their marketing group. So what has that meant? How has that changed how those parts of the growth work with product? Or General Motors, who closed an entire product line, right? Just shut factories down. That's a product division. That's a product line that product leaders are running and saying, okay, here are our vendors, here are suppliers, here's the things we're going to bring in and build, and it's for this customer market. And now leadership saying, actually, like, we're going to cut off that branch of the tree. We're not going to be investing resources in that anymore. So what impact does that have on the rest of the business? Do you start restructuring or doing things differently as you deal with that challenge? And so, of course, like, throughout all of this, standard stuff that all product people, we need to know, and it's really key to us, right? How do you build it over cycles? How do you enable yourself to fail? Maybe you can keep a fail resume or a fail diary where you track, like, what are the failures, right? Like, you'll often learn far more from that than you will from your successes. And this is kind of going to fight back into, as well, a point about survivorship, right? Survivorship bias, right? So the classic example of that was B-29 bombers back during World War II, flying over, getting shot down, some making it back. And the people who looked at the ones coming back were like, oh my gosh, they're riddled with bullets in all these areas. We should totally go and put like metal over these areas and make them more sound. But they're completely ignoring all the ones that never made it back. They're not going and studying those things that didn't make it back. And if they had, perhaps they would say, actually, it's all the areas where these weren't shot that is critical, that if you do get shot here, that's where you're going down. And the same thing kind of factors into companies, right? With all of the kind of the growth in looking at companies of different sizes, writing about them, saying what's the best, what's not the best. We often aren't writing about the ones that didn't survive, right? We're not going and doing deep dives into why did this business fail, right? And some of that's starting to shift as you get maybe more famous examples like Theranos, which is like they looked like a perfect growth company and then it was rotten from the core, right? And the thing is, like, how much of that can you dive deep and understand? Is it tied to not just the customers, the market, the product organization? Like, you as a PM, as a product leader over time, don't just look at the winning cases. Definitely go and study those failures, study what's been going on, and try and figure out a pattern, right? Like, of what works, what doesn't, but also, is it that there's actually certain types of models that make you better? Are these models changing in time? Like, is how we organize our businesses today going to be radically different than say 10 years from now? You know, for instance, like one of the things I'm really keen on and aware of is, okay, there's been so much more technology to enable us to be remote, to work remotely effectively. Is that going to change how I structure my business, you know, 5 years from now when I started, or 10 years from now? And so look at that, right? Like there may be models that are winning that are just as well represented in the failure case, right? And which brings back the point of, like, you know, in the B29, the classic example, it's a fairly finite bound, right? Like the B29 was a pretty standard vehicle. Pilots were very well trained. Sure, there's deviations, but they're pretty much normalized. And they're going into the same environment. They're going after the same types of areas, which have guns, et cetera, shooting up at them and other planes. And so it's not as wildly different as like the market of where we operate business. And also they're far more uniform for the number they are than what we, so there's a lot more data points. Whereas, you know, back when I was at Social Bicycles, right, we had 16 different competitors in the bike share technology space, but that's 16, right? That's not a lot of data points. So how do we know what of our success came from our product organization, from just the product we built, from the customers we had targeted? All of these different factors come in. And so just another thing to really leave you with for product leadership is thinking about your complex system, trying to simplify as much as you can in different areas to conceive of how you're going through questions at certain stages, but also just like really be aware that you may end up having biases built in and try and challenge those biases. And that's, you know, that's it. I'd love to, maybe we can talk for a bit, hear what types of product organization models you've seen, not seen work, which ones you've liked working in or not liked working in, because, you know, this is definitely something I'm going to be dealing with for the rest of my career in product. So it's something I care a lot about.
Great, thank you, Patrick. There were a number of questions, but we are on a tight time schedule here as the second kind of shift of the day begins. But you do have questions from Candice, Fabiola, and Marvin. I encourage everyone to email Patrick with their questions and continue the conversation offline. But again, thank you, Patrick, for today's discussion of the rule of 7, how to structure your product organization to succeed. As always, the presentation will also be posted to our SlideShare channel. A big thank you from me, Nis Frome, mentor lead and moderator for today's talks. To everyone else who joined us today from the Product Mentor. And don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor, visit theproductmentor.com. And if you are looking for a product job or posting a product job, visit theproductjobs.com. For all the mentors and mentees, please check your email for the second Zoom link. And for everyone else, there's another YouTube link. So enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.